My name is Thomas Fletcher. I'm 62 years old, and I've spent nearly all my life ranching cattle on the same dusty stretch of land just outside Tohatchi, New Mexico. My father built the first fences here back in 1967, sinking wooden posts into ground that folks around here said should never have been disturbed. The tribal elders whispered it was sacred land, an old ceremonial place where important rituals had been performed for generations. But my father, stubborn as the sandstone mesas that surround us, shrugged off their warnings like dust from his shoulders. He said that tradition didn't feed anyone, didn't pay bills, didn't keep a roof over your head. For decades we worked this ranch without trouble, pushing superstition aside as easily as we pushed cattle through the gates. The ranch itself covers about 800 acres of high desert scrubland, dotted with juniper and piñon pine carved through by dry arroyos that only run with water during the summer monsoons. The soil is red and sandy, studded with volcanic rock. In summer, temperatures climb past 100 degrees, and in winter the wind cuts through your jacket like a knife. It's hard country, unforgiving country, but it was ours, and we made it work. My father died in 2017, leaving the ranch to me. By then I'd already been running it for years, my hands as calloused and weathered as his had been. I knew every fence post, every water tank, every rocky outcrop on the property. I knew where the cattle liked to graze in spring, and where they'd huddle during winter storms. I knew this land like I knew my own face in the mirror. But last winter, everything changed. It started in January 2022. Cattle started going missing. At first I blamed rustlers. There'd been a string of thefts down in McKinley County, trucks coming in at night and loading up livestock before anyone noticed. Then I thought maybe coyotes, though they usually went after calves, not full-grown steers. Even mountain lions crossed my mind, despite the fact that attacks on cattle were rare this far north. But there was never a sign of blood or struggle. No broken fences, no vehicle tracks, no spent shell casings from poachers' rifles, no drag marks in the dirt, no scattered tufts of hair or hide, just empty space where a steer should have stood and didn't. The first one I noticed was a 2-year-old Hereford cross, a good 1,500 pounds of beef. I'd seen him at evening check, standing with the others near the stock tank. By morning he was gone. I searched for 3 days, riding every corner of the property on my ATV, checking every gully and wash where he might have wandered. Nothing. By summer, I'd lost 5 animals. That was close to $8,000 disappearing like smoke into the clear New Mexico sky. Each loss hit harder than the last. Not just financially, but psychologically. Something was taking my cattle, and I had no idea what or how. The last disappearance happened in mid-July, right at the height of summer heat. A young Angus bull, barely 18 months old, vanished from the south pasture near the old cattle guard. That was when my sister Mary convinced me to call our nephew Elias. He'd just gotten home after 8 years in the Marines, most of it spent in Afghanistan, and if anyone could keep watch and figure out what was happening, it would be him. Elias arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late July, driving a beat-up Ford Ranger that had seen better days. When he stepped out, I was struck by how much he'd changed. The boy who'd left for basic training had been lean and eager, all nervous energy. The man who came back was different, harder, quieter, with eyes that scanned everything as if we were already under attack. He wore his dark hair cut military short, and despite the heat, he moved with measured precision, never wasting motion. "Uncle Thomas," he said, gripping my shoulder firmly. His handshake was strong, controlled. "Show me." I led him out to the south fence where the cattle guard marked the edge of the property. We took my ATV, bumping along the dirt track that ran parallel to the fence line. The recent disappearances always happened right around here. Near the old cattle guard, I'd welded myself back in 19... The structure was simple. Parallel steel rails laid across a ditch about 4 feet deep and 6 feet wide, designed to stop cattle from straying. Cattle won't cross it because their hooves slip between the bars, but vehicles and people can drive right over. The metal was rusted now after 40 years of sun and weather, the original galvanizing long since worn away. We parked about 30 yards from the guard and walked the rest of the way slowly, scanning the ground. The earth here was packed hard from decades of cattle traffic, but the edges were softer, sandy soil that should have held tracks. "Any tracks?" Elias asked, kneeling down and brushing dirt away from something I couldn't quite see. "Nothing useful," I said, shaking my head. Just a few odd prints that don't make sense. Elias traced his fingers over deep impressions in the dirt. They were hoof marks, clearly from cattle, but they were strangely spaced too far apart, as if the animal had been running at full speed. But they ended abruptly after only 15 or 20 feet, as if the steer had simply vanished mid-stride. There were other marks too, fainter ones that I couldn't identify. Elongated depressions that might have been footprints, but they were too narrow, too deep, and they showed what looked like claw marks at the toes. Elias stood and walked a wide circle around the cattle guard, studying the ground, the fence posts, the scrub brush. He checked the fence wire for cuts or damage, examined the posts for signs of tampering. Nothing. Finally, he straightened and looked at me, his expression unreadable. "We'll set up surveillance tonight," he said. "I want to see what's happening with my own eyes." That afternoon, Elias helped me rig floodlights around the cattle guard. We used heavy metal poles salvaged from an old windmill, sinking them 3 feet into the ground and pouring concrete around the bases to keep them stable. The lights themselves were commercial-grade LED floods, bright enough to turn night into day for 100 yards in every direction. We ran power from a portable generator, testing everything twice to make sure it would hold. Nearby, we pulled my battered Winnebago camper into place, positioning it about 50 yards from the cattle guard, with a clear view of the fence line. The camper had been my father's. He'd used it for hunting trips up in the Jemez Mountains, and it hadn't been moved in years. The tires were nearly flat, but we managed to get it where we needed it. Inside, it smelled musty and old, but it was clean enough, and most importantly, it gave us shelter and a vantage point. By nightfall, the ranch was bathed in harsh artificial glare. The floodlights cast stark shadows across the desert scrub, turning every juniper and yucca plant into a potential hiding place. Inside the camper, Elias set up his equipment. A laptop connected to a night vision trail camera he'd mounted on the roof, binoculars, a rangefinder, and his service rifle, an AR-15 he'd legally purchased after his discharge. I brought my own Winchester, 30-30, a lever-action rifle that had belonged to my father. It wasn't tactical or modern, but I could shoot it accurately, and I trusted it. The silence stretched on, punctuated only by Elias's occasional shifting in his chair, and the soft hum of the generator outside. Neither of us spoke much. Elias kept his eyes trained on the monitors, switching between the night vision feed and the view through the camper window. I watched the darkness beyond the lights, my rifle across my lap, feeling foolish and tense at the same time. The hours ticked by slowly. Midnight came and went. 1 a.m. passed. By 2 in the morning, exhaustion was starting to creep in, making my eyes heavy. Then, just after 2 o'clock, something changed. The temperature dropped suddenly, noticeably. I'd lived in New Mexico my entire life, and I was used to desert nights getting cold, but this was different. This was a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to seep through the camper walls despite it being mid-July, when nighttime temperatures rarely dropped below 70 degrees. "You feel that?" Elias murmured, zipping up his jacket. I nodded, pulling my own coat tighter. My breath was starting to fog in front of my face. At 2:47 a.m., a faint rustling whispered through the brush somewhere beyond the lights. Both of us tensed immediately, leaning forward. It wasn't the sound cattle made, that heavy, shuffling movement. This was cautious, measured, like something moving carefully, deliberately trying to stay quiet. At exactly 3:07 a.m., a shadow moved just beyond the brightest reach of the lights. Elias was on his feet instantly, rifle raised to his shoulder, stock pressed tight against his cheek. I squinted hard into the darkness, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. For a moment, the shape stood upright, roughly man-sized but impossibly thin, like someone stretched on a rack. Its proportions were wrong. Arms too long, legs bent at angles that shouldn't have been possible. Then, smoothly and fluidly, it dropped to all fours, moving forward in a strange, jerking gait that made my stomach tighten with instinctive revulsion. It paused at the very edge of visibility, just where the floodlights started to fade into darkness. Its limbs twitched oddly, rhythmically, as if it were breathing hard or struggling with some internal seizure. I could feel the hair standing up on the back of my neck, every primitive instinct in my body screaming that this was wrong, that this thing shouldn't exist. "What the hell is that?" Elias whispered, his voice tight with controlled fear. Before I could answer, the floodlights flickered, just once but enough to blur our vision for a fraction of a second. In that instant, the creature moved. Elias fired. The crack of the rifle was deafening inside the camper, echoing off the metal walls and leaving my ears ringing. Through the window I saw the muzzle flash illuminate the creature for a split second, long enough to see that it was hairless, its skin mottled and gray, stretched tight over visible bones. Its head was elongated, skull-like, with a jaw that hung too low. The figure twisted aside with inhuman speed, moving like a snake, and vanished behind a nearby bluff of red sandstone about 70 yards to the east. The whole thing had taken maybe 3 seconds from the moment Elias fired to the moment it disappeared. "Did you hit it?" I asked, my voice coming out rougher than I intended, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I could feel it in my throat. "I don't know," Elias said. His voice was steady, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the rifle. "I don't think so. It moved before I pulled the trigger." We stood there for a moment, both of us breathing hard, adrenaline flooding through our systems. Then Elias grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight from the table and chambered another round. "Stay here," he said. "The hell I will," I replied, grabbing my own rifle and flashlight. We moved cautiously from the camper, weapons raised, flashlights cutting through the darkness in narrow beams. The night air was still bitterly cold and our breath came out in visible puffs. Every sound seemed amplified, our boots crunching on gravel, the distant call of a coyote, the soft whisper of wind through the sage. We walked slowly toward where the creature had disappeared, sweeping our lights across the ground. For several tense minutes we found nothing. Then Elias stopped abruptly, his beam fixed on something at his feet. "Uncle Thomas," he said quietly, "look at this." I moved beside him and looked down. In the soft dirt near a stand of rabbit brush, pressed clearly into the soil, were tracks. They were roughly foot-shaped but wrong in every detail, too narrow, too long, with deep gouges at the ends where claws, actual claws, had dug into the earth. Each print was nearly 10 inches long, and they were spaced far apart, suggesting whatever made them had an unnaturally long stride. We followed the tracks for about 30 yards. They led toward the bluff, weaving between bushes, sometimes appearing on hard rock where they shouldn't have been visible at all, as if the creature weighed almost nothing. Then at the base of the bluff they simply stopped. Not faded away, not obscured by rock, just stopped, as if whatever made them had either climbed straight up the 20-foot cliff face or simply ceased to exist. Elias swept his flashlight up the rock wall, searching for handholds or ledges. Nothing. The sandstone was smooth, weathered by centuries of wind and rain into gentle curves that offered no purchase. "What is this, Uncle Thomas?" he asked, his voice tight. I didn't answer right away. I couldn't. My mouth was dry, and my hands were shaking slightly despite my best efforts to control them. Instead, I looked up into the sky, black as tar, and scattered with more stars than seemed possible, and felt something I'd ignored for decades whisper quietly inside me. My grandfather's stories. Old tales told around winter fires about things that walked the reservation at night, about ceremonies that kept evil at bay, about what happened when those ceremonies were interrupted or forgotten. "I don't know," I finally said, but I was lying. Deep down, in a part of me I'd tried to bury with education and rationality and modern thinking, I knew exactly what this was. We stood there for a long time, two men with rifles and flashlights, staring at impossible tracks in the dirt, before finally walking back to the camper in silence. Neither of us slept for the rest of the night. The morning sun rose over the mesas, pale and hot, casting long shadows that stretched across the ranch like black fingers reaching toward us. Elias and I stood quietly by the south fence, staring down at yet another empty spot where a steer had stood just yesterday evening. I'd counted the cattle at dusk, 43 head in the south pasture. This morning there were 42. The ground was churned up, scuffed and disturbed by hooves. Whatever had happened, the steer had been agitated, possibly terrified. But again there was no blood, no scattered hide, no signs of a predator attack. And most disturbing of all, the tracks. Those same elongated, clawed prints led from the cattle guard toward where the animal had been, then back toward the bluff, vanishing again at the rock face. "This doesn't make any sense," Elias said, his frustration evident. He crouched low, examining the tracks again in full daylight. Under the harsh morning sun they looked even more wrong, more impossible. The depth suggested significant weight, but the spacing and the way they appeared on solid rock suggested something nearly weightless. It looks almost human, but it's not. The proportions are wrong. The gait is wrong. Everything about this is wrong. I glanced toward the sandstone outcropping that rose about 40 feet above the surrounding terrain. It was less than half a mile away, and from here it looked harmless, just another weathered rock formation in a landscape full of them. I'd walked past that bluff hundreds of times without giving it much thought, had even sheltered against it during sudden rainstorms. Today it felt different, heavier somehow, as if it were watching us. "I'm going up there," Elias said, standing and dusting off his knees with sharp, precise movements. "Maybe I can see something from higher ground, find where these tracks actually lead." Before I could argue or suggest we call the tribal police, he'd already headed back to the camper to grab his gear. He returned with his rifle, a commercial drone in a hard-shell case, and a GoPro camera mounted on a chest harness. He moved toward the bluff with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done reconnaissance hundreds of times, weaving carefully through the brush, eyes constantly scanning, weapon at the ready. I watched him go, that cold uneasiness from last night settling back into my chest. I tried to busy myself with ranch work, checking water tanks, inspecting fence lines in other pastures, but my eyes kept drifting back toward that bluff. Hours crawled by. The sun climbed higher, the temperature with it, until it was pushing 95 degrees. By noon, I was genuinely worried. Elias had been gone for over 3 hours, far longer than it should have taken to climb the bluff and scout around. It was nearly 2 in the afternoon when I finally saw Elias emerging from the scrub brush. He moved quickly, his head down, shoulders tight. Even from a distance I could see the tension in his posture. Something had shaken him.
"What did you find?" I asked as he approached, trying not to sound as nervous as I felt.
He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he sat heavily on the trailer steps, pulling off his cap and wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. His face looked strained, eyes harder than they'd been that morning, jaw tight. "There's something up there," he said finally. "Something old." He pulled out his phone, swiping through photos with sharp, angry gestures. About 200 yards past the bluff, there's a clearing. Small, maybe 20 feet across, hidden by junipers. In the center, there's a fire ring. Old stones, blackened by heat, arranged in a circle. Around it, there are bones. Small animals mostly. Rabbits, birds, a coyote skull, but some larger ones too. Cattle vertebrae. Ribs, a skull that might have been from one of ours. He handed me the phone. The images showed exactly what he described. A crude stone circle, partially buried in wind-blown sand, surrounded by dried, brittle sage and the skeletal remains of animals. Some of the bones looked fresh, picked clean but not yet bleached by the sun. Others were older, graying and cracked. But that wasn't the strangest part. Behind the fire ring, built against a natural indentation in the rock face, was a cairn, a deliberate stack of stones about 4 feet high. The stones were dark, not the red sandstone common to the area, but black volcanic rock that must have been carried here from somewhere else. They were stacked carefully, precisely, yet somehow the whole structure looked wrong, unstable, as if it had been built in haste by nervous hands. "What is it?" I asked quietly, dread growing stronger inside me like ice forming in my veins. Elias shook his head slowly. "I don't know, but I can tell you this. It didn't feel right. Soon as I got within 50 feet, the temperature dropped. Not much, but enough to notice. And my drone started glitching. Glitching how? Controls froze. Screen went black. The whole system crashed, and it fell out of the sky. Smashed the camera housing. He showed me the drone. The front was cracked, the gimbal bent. I tried to restart it, but nothing worked. Even the GoPro cut out. Battery showed full, but the screen just went dead." He pulled out the camera, popping open the battery compartment. The lithium battery looked fine, no swelling or damage, but when he tried to power the camera on, nothing happened. "Electronic interference," I suggested, though I didn't really believe it. "From what? There's nothing out here that could cause that. No power lines, no radio towers." He looked at me directly. "Uncle Thomas, that place is wrong. I've been in some bad places overseas. Places where you could feel death in the air. This was worse. Whatever's out there, it's focused on that spot." We sat in silence for a moment. I wanted to dismiss it, to find some rational explanation. But after what we'd seen last night, after decades of ignoring the stories my grandfather told, I couldn't lie to myself anymore. "The fire pit," I said. "Was it recent?" The ashes weren't more than a couple weeks old. Still had some structure to them. Hadn't been completely scattered by wind. That was somehow worse than if it had been ancient. It meant someone, or something, was actively using that place. Recently. Regularly. As the sun dipped lower, shadows lengthening and blending together until the land turned purple and gray, my sister Mary arrived. She pulled her Chevy Silverado up close to the camper, and when she got out, her face was lined with worry. Mary was 3 years younger than me, with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the same weathered features that came from a lifetime in the high desert. "I talked to Auntie Lorraine," she said without preamble, her voice tense and urgent. "She said you needed to know the truth. This land wasn't supposed to be ours, Thomas. It wasn't supposed to be anyone's." Elias and I exchanged looks but stayed quiet, waiting for her to continue. Mary took a deep breath, her eyes haunted in a way I'd never seen before. "Grandfather used to talk about ceremonies done here. Old ways that most people have forgotten. Enemy way rituals, done for warriors coming back from battle, to cleanse them of the ghosts they carried. One ceremony was interrupted long ago, before we were born, maybe before even grandfather was born. Lightning struck the hogan where they were performing the ritual. Killed 2 men instantly, the medicine man and a warrior. They never finished the ceremony. They never closed it properly. And according to Auntie Lorraine, that left something open, a doorway that should have been sealed." Her words hung heavily in the desert air, thick with implications I didn't want to consider. My grandfather had mentioned enemy way ceremonies before, healing rites meant to cleanse those who'd encountered death or violence, to restore balance and harmony. But I'd always thought they were just cultural traditions, symbolic gestures that didn't have any real power. Now, standing in the lengthening shadows with the memory of last night still fresh and terrifying, I wasn't so sure. "You think that's why this is happening?" Elias asked quietly. "That whatever's taking the cattle is connected to those rituals? To that interrupted ceremony?" Mary nodded slowly, her expression grim. "That's what Auntie Lorraine thinks. She said when your father built his fences here, when he started running cattle over sacred ground, it stirred something awake. Something that's been waiting." Night fell quickly, as it always did in the desert. One moment the sky was purple and gold, the next it was black and filled with stars. We prepared again, this time with more equipment and more caution. Elias rigged motion sensors around the perimeter, small units that would ping his phone if anything moved within their detection range. He strung tripwires in the brush, attached to glow sticks that would illuminate if something touched them. We double-checked the floodlights, tested the generator, loaded our rifles, and settled in to wait. Elias's dog, a German shepherd named Scout that he'd adopted after coming home, had been calm and steady all day. But as darkness fell, the dog began acting strange, whining softly, pacing in the small camper, refusing to settle down despite Elias's commands. Finally, Scout wedged himself under the small dinette table and wouldn't come out, his eyes wide and white-rimmed. "I've never seen him like this," Elias said, troubled. "Not even during fireworks. He's a trained military dog, nothing spooks him." Just before midnight we settled in again, watching quietly through the windows. The land was silent around us, but the cattle in the pasture were restless, moving more than usual, their low calls carrying across the distance. Several times I saw groups of them bunch together, then scatter suddenly for no apparent reason. Time crept forward slowly, each minute feeling like an hour. My eyes burned from staring into the darkness beyond the lights. My hands were sweaty despite the cold that had crept in again. That same unnatural chill from the night before. At exactly 2:59 a.m., I remember looking at my watch just before it happened. The silence broke. Something scraped softly against the earth, a sound like bone dragging across stone. It came from the east, beyond the floodlights, moving slowly. Then it stopped, started again, stopped, as if whatever was making the sound was testing its approach, learning the boundaries of our defenses. Elias stiffened beside me, his hand tightening on his rifle grip. Scout whimpered under the table, a pitiful sound I would never have expected from such a powerful animal. The scraping changed. Now it sounded like labored breathing, wet, uneven, a rattling rasp's that made my skin crawl. It was circling us, staying just beyond the lights, moving with deliberate patience. "It's back," Elias whispered, his voice barely audible. I strained my eyes into the shadows, trying to find it, but it stayed just outside our vision, moving carefully, intelligently, avoiding the brightest areas of illumination. The motion sensors began pinging. One, then another, then a third, tracking movement in an arc around our position. Then the shape emerged. It came low to the ground this time, crawling on elbows and knees in that awful, disjointed way that violated every natural law of movement. Its spine arched and twisted as it moved, joints bending backward, limbs dragging through dirt in a rhythmic, deliberate pattern. It stayed just beyond the edge of the floodlights, close enough that I could make out its silhouette but not its details, circling us in a slow spiral that gradually drew tighter. The air grew colder with each rotation it made, my breath coming out in thick clouds. Frost actually began forming on the inside of the camper windows. Elias raised his rifle, tracking the creature's movement, waiting for it to come into clear view. But it moved unpredictably, zigzagging, stopping and starting, never giving him a clean shot. His breathing was controlled, measured, the way he'd been trained, but I could see the slight tremor in his hands. My own breath came faster, sharp bursts of adrenaline making me dizzy and nauseated. I gripped my Winchester so tightly my knuckles ached, fighting the overwhelming urge to simply run, to get in my truck and drive away and never come back. The creature stopped suddenly, perhaps 30 yards from the camper, just at the boundary between light and shadow. From this distance, I could see more details that I immediately wished I hadn't. Its skin was gray and mottled, pulled tight over bones that protruded at sharp angles. Its spine was visible, each vertebra distinct, curving in a way that looked impossibly flexible. The head was elongated, skull-like, with a jaw that hung slack, revealing what might have been teeth. It seemed to stare directly at us, though I couldn't see its eyes, if it even had eyes. Then it opened its mouth, and a sound came out that I will never forget. A low, rasping growl that rumbled through the ground itself, vibrating through the camper floor and into my bones. It was the sound of something ancient and hungry, something that had no place in the modern world. For a long moment, none of us moved. Even Scout had gone silent under the table, frozen in absolute terror. Then, abruptly, the creature turned away. It moved silently, fluidly toward the cattle guard, its form disappearing into the darkness beyond our lights. The motion sensors continued flashing wildly. The tripwires remained untouched. The floodlights stayed bright and steady, but it was gone. When we finally ventured outside, rifles raised and hearts still hammering in our chests, we found fresh tracks, those same impossible prints leading from the point where it had circled us toward the cattle guard. The gate was still locked, the fences intact and undamaged. Nothing had been broken or forced. Beyond the cattle guard, we found where a steer had stood. The ground was torn up, showing signs of panic, but the animal itself was gone, vanished without a trace, leaving only tracks that led to the fence line and then simply stopped. We stood there helpless and silent, our breath fogging in the frigid air, staring out at the black emptiness beyond the property line. Elias shook his head slowly, frustration and fear etched deeply into his features. "Whatever this thing is," he said quietly, his voice rough, "it knows exactly what it's doing. It's intelligent. It's hunting." I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just stood there staring into the darkness, my grandfather's stories echoing through my mind, and knew with absolute certainty that we were in over our heads. We weren't dealing with an animal or even a human threat. We had disturbed something that had been waiting in the darkness of that unfinished ceremony for decades, maybe longer. And it wasn't going to stop until someone made it stop. At first light, with my hands still shaking slightly from the night before, I called Harold Benelli. He was a Hatawi, a traditional medicine man, living out near Tohachi, about 15 miles south of my ranch. Harold had helped families throughout the area for over 40 years, performing ceremonies, blessing homes, and dealing with things that most people preferred not to talk about in daylight. When I explained what was happening, how the cattle were vanishing, the creature we'd seen, the old fire ring Elias had found, Harold listened quietly, occasionally humming under his breath in a way that suggested he was considering something carefully. "I'll be there before noon," he finally said, his voice gravelly with age. Then he hung up without further comment. When he arrived in his ancient Ford pickup, He stepped out slowly, his lined face solemn as he gazed across the land. Harold was in his late 70s, small and wiry, with long gray hair pulled back in a traditional bun. His eyes, though clouded slightly with age, were sharp and knowing. Without greeting or preamble, he motioned for Elias and me to follow him toward the bluff. We walked in silence, Harold moving with surprising quickness despite his age, picking his way through the scrub with the ease of someone who'd walked this kind of country his entire life. When we reached the clearing Elias had found, Harold stopped abruptly. His expression tightened as his gaze fell on the blackened stones and scattered bones. Slowly, carefully, he knelt beside the fire ring. Not touching anything but studying it intently, he picked up a handful of dirt, letting it sift through his fingers while he murmured something in Navajo that I couldn't quite hear. Then he moved to the stone cairn, standing before it in silence for several long minutes. "This place has been silent too long," he said finally, his voice heavy with concern. He stood again, brushing dirt from his hands with deliberate movements. "What you found here opened something that was never properly closed. The old ones performed ceremonies at this site to cleanse warriors who had seen death and violence. It was a place of healing, of restoration. But the last ritual was interrupted. Lightning struck the hogan during the ceremony. 2 men died, the medicine man performing the rite and the warrior being cleansed. That left a doorway standing open, a pathway between worlds that should have been sealed. Nobody remembered. The knowledge was lost, or perhaps deliberately forgotten. But doors like that don't close themselves, and something found its way through. "Can you close it?" Elias asked, his voice tight with barely controlled tension. Harold stared out across the scrubland, past the mesas and into the distance, as if seeing something beyond the physical landscape. After a long moment, he nodded slowly. "We must finish what was started. Tonight, before it returns again. But understand, this will not be easy, and there are no guarantees. What comes through such doorways does not want to leave." We spent the afternoon preparing under Harold's careful direction. He had us gather cedar branches from specific trees, choosing them himself and cutting them with prayers spoken in traditional Navajo. We collected crushed turquoise that Mary brought from town, along with white ash from a fire Harold built himself using specific woods. At each corner of the property, north, south, east, and west, we placed bundles of these materials, Harold speaking over them in a language I barely understood. In front of the camper, Harold created a sand painting, each detail placed with painstaking precision. He used colored sand, white, yellow, red, and black, creating intricate geometric patterns and symbolic figures that represented balance, protection, and healing. It took him 3 hours to complete, and by the time he finished, the sun was already beginning to set. As twilight deepened, Harold lit bundles of sage and cedar, filling the air with thick, pungent smoke that burned my eyes and throat. The scent was powerful, primal, triggering memories I didn't know I had. My grandfather's hogan, winter ceremonies, the smell of tradition and belief. When full darkness finally came, the 3 of us stood together near the cattle guard, forming a loose triangle. Harold began his chant, a low rhythmic prayer in traditional Navajo that rose and fell like wind moving through canyon walls. His voice, though aged, was strong and steady, carrying across the desert with surprising power. Elias and I kept watch, rifles ready but held low, eyes straining into the shadows beyond the glow of our lights. The cattle in the pasture had gone completely silent, not a single call or movement. Even the usual night sounds, coyotes, insects, the rustling of small animals had ceased entirely. Hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. My legs ached from standing, my back hurt, my eyes burned. Elias shifted his weight constantly, jaw tight, eyes never still. Harold continued his chant, never faltering, his words flowing in an endless stream. Just after 3 in the morning, something crashed violently against the north fence. The sound of metal shrieking and buckling carried clearly across the distance. Elias spun toward it, raising his rifle to his shoulder. Before either of us could react, the floodlights exploded, all of them simultaneously, in a cascade of shattering glass and sparking electronics. Darkness surged around us like a physical thing, broken only by the faint glow of stars overhead and the dying embers of Harold's fire. Yet somehow, impossibly, the boundary we'd marked, the line of cedar branches and ash and turquoise held firm. I could see it, a faint shimmer in the air like heat waves, glowing with a soft blue-white light that came from nowhere I could identify. Slowly, gradually, a form emerged from the shadows beyond that boundary. It moved the way we'd seen before, dragging itself forward in that awful jerking crawl, staying just outside the line Harold had drawn. It circled us slowly, testing the barrier, reaching toward it with those two long limbs. In the starlight, I saw it clearly for the first time. It was painfully, impossibly thin. All bones and stretched skin, joints protruding at unnatural angles. Its spine curved and twisted like a snake, visible through translucent flesh. The head was elongated, the skull almost horse-like in its length, but narrower, with a mouth that opened too wide, revealing rows of broken, uneven teeth. Where its eyes should have been, there were only hollow sockets that somehow still seemed to see, to know exactly where we stood. It reached toward the barrier again, and this time its fingers, if they could be called that, actually touched it. Where it made contact, the air sparked and hissed, blue light flaring brightly. The creature recoiled with a thin, whistling shriek that made my teeth ache. Beside me, Elias raised his rifle. His hands were steady, his breathing controlled, but I could see the terror in his eyes. I felt the same fear, a primal panic that urged me to run, to break formation, to abandon everything, and just escape. "Do not fire," Harold said firmly, never pausing in his chant. His voice cut through my panic, anchoring me. "Hold the line, it cannot cross." The creature tested the barrier again, moving along its length, searching for weakness. Harold's chanting grew louder, more urgent. He threw more herbs onto the fire, sage, cedar, something else I didn't recognize, sending thick smoke billowing into the air. The creature shuddered violently. It opened that impossibly wide mouth and screamed, a sound that was nothing like anything earthly, a mixture of pain and rage and something that might have been despair. The sound cut through me like knives, making my vision blur and my knees weak. Then, slowly, agonizingly, it began to retreat. Not by choice, I realized, but as if being pulled backward by invisible hands. It fought against whatever force was compelling it, digging those clawed fingers into the earth, leaving deep furrows in the dirt. But it continued moving away from us, backward toward the bluff, toward the clearing where the stone cairn stood. Harold's chanting reached a crescendo, his voice powerful and commanding. The creature screamed again, that awful sound echoing off the mesas and bouncing back at us from every direction. Then abruptly it was gone, not fading away, but simply ceasing to exist, as if a door had slammed shut. For several long minutes afterward, none of us moved. We stood frozen, barely breathing, listening to the night. Slowly, gradually, normal sounds returned. A coyote called in the distance. Crickets began chirping. The cattle started moving again, their soft lowing carrying across the darkness. Harold stopped chanting. He lowered his hands gently, exhaustion evident in every movement. "It is done," he said quietly, his voice hoarse from hours of ceremony. "The doorway is closed. It cannot return. Not here. Not through that place." Relief flooded through me so suddenly and powerfully that my legs nearly gave out. I sat down hard on the ground, my rifle falling from nerveless fingers. Elias let out a long, shuddering breath, lowering his weapon slowly. At sunrise, the ranch felt different, lighter somehow, as if an oppressive weight had been lifted. The air was warmer, cleaner. Birds sang in the junipers. The land itself seemed to breathe easier. Harold finished his ritual, carefully dismantling the sand painting and gathering the materials. He buried the used herbs and ashes in specific patterns around the property, marking the boundaries with prayers. Before he left, he stood with me for a moment, his old hand on my shoulder. "You should not stay here," he said gently, his eyes filled with somber knowledge. "The ceremony is complete. The door is closed. But this land remembers what was done here, both the sacred and the profane. Some places hold memories in their bones. This is one of them. It may never truly rest." I nodded slowly, understanding exactly what he meant. Some things, once disturbed, can never be completely put right again. Over the next 2 years, I kept the ranch but never lived there again. I stayed in town, driving out only during daylight hours to check on things, hiring help to manage the cattle. The disappearances stopped completely. Not another animal was lost, but I could never shake the feeling that I was being watched whenever I was there. that something was waiting patiently in the shadows of the mesas. In late 2021, when an energy company approached me with an offer to buy the land for natural gas exploration, I accepted without hesitation. It felt like a relief, like finally stepping away from something heavy that had been pressing against me for years. Elias moved to Window Rock shortly after that night, taking a job with the tribal government. We didn't speak often, and when we did, we never mentioned what we'd seen at the cattle guard. Not until one evening months later when I heard from Mary that he'd shared the story with a few people at a gathering. It didn't bother me. I knew he'd only told it to free himself, to try to make sense of what we'd experienced, hoping that speaking it aloud might help him finally sleep through the night. In the end, the ranch sits abandoned now, slowly being reclaimed by wind and sun, and the patient desert. The fences are rusting away, the buildings collapsing. Someday soon, it will look as if we were never there at all. And though I never returned after I signed the final papers, sometimes late at night I still wake suddenly from dreams I can't quite remember. My heart racing, imagining something thin and hungry scratching at an invisible barrier, circling endlessly in the darkness, patient and eternal, waiting for someone to open a door that should remain forever closed. I was part of a search and rescue team dispatched to Olympic National Forest in the summer of 1991. The call came in late Thursday night just as I was finishing paperwork at the station. I had been with the Pacific Northwest Search and Rescue Unit for nearly 7 years by then, and routine calls like this one barely registered as concerning anymore. "Hiker overdue," the dispatcher said. "Name's Terry Fishgold, 47-year-old male, experienced backpacker. Wife reports he hasn't returned from a solo trip. Last seen Tuesday morning at the Quinault River trailhead." James Wilson, our team coordinator, took down the details while I gathered my gear. Terry's wife had waited until Wednesday evening before calling, assuming he'd just extended his trip by a day. When Thursday passed with no word, she contacted authorities. "What's his intended route?" I asked, spreading out the topographical map of the region. "He planned to hike north along the river for about 8 miles, then camp at the western ridge before looping back," Wilson replied. "Wife says he's hiked this trail dozens of times over the years." That was both good and bad news. Good because a familiar route meant less chance of getting seriously lost. Bad because experienced hikers rarely make simple mistakes. When they go missing, something significant has usually happened. Any medical conditions? Equipment concerns? Healthy guy, regular medication for mild hypertension. Well equipped with a green Kelty backpack, 3 days of supplies, standard emergency gear, and a compass. No GPS or satellite phone. I nodded. In 1991, satellite technology wasn't common among recreational hikers. Most relied on maps, compasses, and knowledge of the terrain. "Weather's been clear, no storms reported," Wilson continued. "Search begins at dawn. Local law enforcement and volunteer teams are already being notified." I drove home that night with the familiar pre-search routine running through my mind. Pack extra layers, fresh batteries, water purification tablets. Check the first aid kit, emergency rations, and signaling equipment. I laid everything out methodically, as I'd done countless times before. I lived alone in a small apartment outside Port Angeles. Photographs of mountains, forests, and successful rescues adorned my walls. Visual reminders of why I chose this work. After 7 years of search and rescue operations, I'd developed a reputation for thoroughness and intuition. Some team members joked that I could think like a lost hiker. That night, as I prepared my gear, I found myself wondering what Terry Fishgold had been thinking when he realized he wasn't going to make it home on schedule. Sleep came fitfully that night. Not from anxiety, these calls were routine after all, but from the mental preparation. In my experience, 90% of missing hikers were found within the first 24 hours, often just off trail, injured but alive. I expected Terry would be among them. The Olympic National Forest was vast and unforgiving, but it generally surrendered its temporary captives without much resistance. How profoundly mistaken I was. Dawn broke gray and cool as I arrived at the Quinault River trailhead. Mist clung to the towering Douglas firs and western red cedars, creating ghostly silhouettes against the nascent light. A collection of vehicles already populated the small gravel parking area. 2 Sheriff's Department SUVs, Wilson's truck, several volunteer vehicles, and an ambulance standing by as a precaution. 42 people had answered the call, an impressive turnout for a routine search. Local law enforcement, 3 professional search and rescue teams, including our own, and about 20 civilian volunteers with varying degrees of experience. I recognized most of the professionals and nodded to them as I unloaded my gear. Wilson stood at the trailhead kiosk with Terry's wife, Brenda, a petite woman with prematurely silver hair and worry etched across her face. She clutched a photograph of Terry, a smiling, bearded man with weather-worn skin and bright eyes that suggested an affable personality. "He always comes back," she was saying as I approached. 30 years of hiking these forests, never once missed his return date by more than a few hours. Something's happened. The certainty in her voice gave me pause. Family members typically oscillated between fear and hope during these briefings. Brenda displayed neither, just a stone-faced conviction that her husband was in trouble. Wilson introduced me as one of the team leaders, and I took a moment to study the photograph. "Any specific concerns about this trip? Anything different from his usual routine?" I asked. Brenda shook her head. "Same trail he's hiked every summer for the past decade. Same gear, same plan. 3 days. Up, over, and back." "Did he mention any wildlife concerns recently? Bear activity? Cougar sightings?" "No, nothing like that. Terry respects the wildlife, carries bear spray, hangs his food properly. He's meticulous about those things." I nodded, mentally processing the information. Experienced hiker, familiar route, proper equipment, no reported wildlife concerns or weather events. The equation didn't add up to trouble, yet here we were. Wilson gathered everyone for the briefing at exactly 6:15 a.m. The search area was divided into a grid, radiating outward from Terry's planned route. Each team was assigned a sector to sweep methodically. "We start with the assumption that he's injured but mobile," Wilson explained. "First priority is checking the main trail and immediate vicinity. Second priority is any terrain features where an injured hiker might seek shelter. Rock formations, large fallen trees, stream beds. We're looking for tracks, gear, any sign of recent human passage." My team was assigned the western edge of the grid near the river. 4 experienced searchers plus myself, responsible for a sector approximately 2 miles wide by 8 miles long, from the trailhead to Terry's intended camping spot at the ridge. "We maintain radio contact at all times," Wilson continued. "Check-ins every 30 minutes. If you find anything, and I mean anything, report it immediately. Don't disturb potential evidence." Evidence. The word hung in the air. In search and rescue, we tried to maintain optimism, but Wilson's choice of terminology acknowledged the darker possibilities we all recognized. The teams dispersed, moving into their assigned sectors with practiced efficiency. My group, myself, Kira Johnson, Hector Rodriguez, Patrick O'Sullivan, and William Chen, performed a final equipment check before heading out. "Standard sweep formation," I instructed. 20-foot spacing, visual contact with adjacent team members at all times. Audible calls every 5 minutes. We moved slowly and thoroughly. The forest enveloped us as we left the trailhead behind. Within minutes, the sounds of the assembly area faded, replaced by the subtle ambient noise of the Olympic wilderness. Wind through needles, distant bird calls, the persistent murmur of the Kino River to our west. In those first moments, the forest seemed entirely ordinary. I had no inkling of the horror that waited deeper within. The initial hours of the search proceeded methodically. We moved through our sector with practiced efficiency, calling Terry's name at regular intervals and scanning the forest floor for any disturbance. The weather cooperated. Clear skies, mild temperature, light breeze. Ideal conditions for both searchers and, theoretically, for survival. "Terrain's pretty forgiving through here," Patrick observed around mid-morning. "If he injured himself, plenty of water sources nearby. Good natural shelter options. I nodded in agreement. This section of the Olympic National Forest was relatively hospitable as wilderness went. Dense tree cover provided protection from elements, the river offered water, and the undergrowth was navigable. A competent outdoorsman like Terry would have good odds for survival even with a significant injury. We continued north, maintaining our careful sweep pattern. Occasional radio check-ins from other teams revealed nothing unusual. Standard procedure, standard results. By 11:30 a.m., we had covered approximately 3 miles of our sector without finding a single indication of Terry's passage. The first disruption to our routine came shortly after noon. "Team leader, this is Chen," my radio crackled. William's voice sounded controlled but tense. "I found something, approximately half a mile east of my last reported position." "Nature of the find?" I responded, already adjusting my course. "You'll need to see this," he replied simply. The tone in his voice accelerated my pace. I radioed the rest of the team to converge on William's coordinates and moved briskly through the underbrush. When I arrived about 15 minutes later, I found William standing in a small clearing, his gaze directed upward. Patrick arrived moments later, followed by Kira and Hector. All of us stood silently, looking up at William's discovery. Suspended approximately 30 feet above ground, caught in the upper branches of a slender hemlock, was a backpack. The distinctive green kelty with a red patch sewn onto the side matched the description of Terry's equipment perfectly. But its condition and position defied immediate explanation. The pack hung awkwardly, impaled on several branches. Its contents had spilled partially, scattering items among the upper foliage and onto the forest floor below. Most disturbing was the condition of the pack itself. The fabric was shredded in long, parallel tiers, as though something with immense strength had ripped through the reinforced nylon. "How the hell did it get up there?" Patrick whispered. The question hung in the air. The hemlock's trunk was smooth, its lower branches too thin to support an adult's weight. The pack's position suggested it had been thrown or propelled upward with tremendous force. "Could a bear have done this?" Kira asked, though her tone suggested skepticism. I'd participated in numerous wilderness searches involving bear encounters. This didn't fit the pattern. Bears typically tore into packs on the ground, scattered the contents widely in search of food, and left distinctive claw and bite marks. This pack looked as though it had been deliberately placed beyond reach, torn with almost surgical precision. "We need to retrieve it," I decided. "Hector, you're our best climber. Can you rig a line and get up there?" Hector studied the tree, calculating risks and approach. "Tree's not ideal for climbing, but I can set up a rope system. Might damage some branches getting up there." "Proceed," I instructed. "Document everything with the camera before disturbing the scene." While Hector prepared his climbing gear, I radioed Wilson with our discovery. His response was immediate. "Photograph everything. Catalog any items recovered. This changes the search parameters." Indeed it did. Finding Terry's pack in such a condition shifted our assumptions dramatically. This was no longer a search for a hiker who might have wandered off trail or suffered a minor injury. Something more disturbing had occurred. Hector ascended methodically, photographing the pack's position from multiple angles before carefully dislodging it from the branches. The process took nearly 40 minutes, during which the rest of us documented the ground beneath the tree, searching for any additional evidence. When the pack finally reached the ground, we examined it thoroughly. The damage was even more apparent up close. 5 parallel tiers ran from top to bottom on the main compartment, each approximately 8 inches long. The fabric between tiers was stretched and deformed, suggesting whatever had caused them had tremendous strength. Inside we found Terry's water bottle, cracked but still containing liquid. A half-eaten sandwich wrapped in waxed paper was crushed and soiled. A map, compass, flashlight, and first aid kit were still present, though disarranged. His wallet remained in an inner pocket, containing identification, $47 in cash, and credit cards. "No blood," Patrick noted, carefully examining the pack's interior. "If something attacked him while he was wearing this, we'd expect blood traces." He was right. Despite the violent damage to the pack, There were no biological indicators, no blood, tissue, or hair from either Terry or a potential animal attacker. So he wasn't wearing it when, whatever this was, happened, Kira concluded. Maybe he set it down. And then it got thrown 30 feet into a tree, Hector questioned, disbelief evident in his voice. I photographed each item as we removed it from the pack, creating a detailed inventory. Nothing seemed missing except for Terry himself. Let's expand our search perimeter around this area, I instructed. Whatever happened here, it represents our first solid lead. As the team spread out in a wider search pattern, I found myself studying the forest with new attention. The trees suddenly seemed more imposing, the shadows between them deeper. For the first time since we'd entered the woods that morning, I felt a distinct sense of unease, as though the forest had transformed from a neutral environment into something actively hostile. I dismissed the thought as unprofessional. Evidence and facts were our tools, not emotional reactions or imagined threats. Yet as I rejoined the search, scanning the ground for further signs, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being observed. The discovery of the backpack altered the rhythm of our search. We moved more cautiously now, our calls for Terry less frequent, our attention divided between searching for signs of the missing hiker and maintaining awareness of our surroundings. The easy professional confidence of the morning had given way to a tense vigilance. 2 hours after recovering the pack, the silence of the forest was broken by Kira's voice on the radio. Team leader, I've found a boot. Western quadrant of our expanded perimeter. I acknowledged her transmission and converged on her position with Patrick, while Hector and William continued searching the eastern section. When we reached Kira, she stood beside a small clearing, pointing to a brown leather hiking boot standing upright in the center. The boot, a Danner model matching the description provided by Terry's wife, stood as though its owner had simply stepped out of it. Laces tied, no visible damage, no disturbance to the surrounding soil. It was positioned with an unnatural precision that immediately struck me as deliberate. No prints leading to or from it, Kira observed. No scuff marks, no drag signs. I approached cautiously, photographing the boot from multiple angles before examining it more closely. The interior was clean, dry, and empty. No blood, no tissue, nothing to indicate a violent removal from its wearer's foot. Mark the location, I instructed. Bag the boot after you've documented everything. Patrick was scanning the surrounding area methodically. Should find the other one nearby if this follows normal pattern. But nothing about this search was following normal patterns. The radio crackled to life, this time with a transmission from another search team operating nearly 2 miles east of our position. Base, this is Team Echo. We've found a boot with remains. The hesitation in the voice conveyed volumes. I exchanged glances with Kira and Patrick before responding. Team Echo, this is Alpha Team Leader. Please clarify, remains. A moment of silence then. A boot with a severed foot still inside. Right foot male, severed approximately mid-ankle. Tissue condition suggests recent trauma. No other remains located in immediate vicinity. The information hit like a physical blow. One boot standing empty in an undisturbed clearing. Another boot 2 miles away containing its owner's severed foot. The implications were both obvious and incomprehensible. Wilson's voice came over the radio. All teams acknowledge new information. This is now a potential crime scene. State police have been notified and are en route. Continue search operations but exercise extreme caution. No one searches alone. Hourly check-ins mandatory. I instructed Kira to secure the empty boot as evidence, then gathered my team for a brief conference. We're dealing with something unprecedented, I stated flatly. The distribution of evidence suggests either multiple perpetrators or a single perpetrator covering significant ground. Either way, we proceed with maximum caution. You think someone did this? Hector asked, skepticism evident in his voice. Not an animal attack or accident? An accident doesn't place an empty boot in one clearing and a severed foot 2 miles away, I replied. As for animal attacks, I've worked dozens. They don't leave manufactured items neatly arranged. They drag, scatter, consume. So we're looking for what? A murderer? Patrick's voice was low. We're looking for Terry Fishgold, I corrected. Same as before, but with awareness that the circumstances of his disappearance involved deliberate human action. We resumed our search with heightened vigilance, maintaining closer proximity to each other than standard procedure dictated. The forest, which hours earlier had seemed merely indifferent to our presence, now felt actively threatening. Every shadow might conceal a predator, not the four-legged kind we were trained to handle, but something far more dangerous. The next discovery came shortly after 3:00 p.m., when William called out from 20 yards to my right. "Blood sign," he reported tersely. I moved to his position and observed what he'd found. A small smear of what appeared to be blood on the trunk of a western hemlock, approximately 5 feet above ground level. The stain was roughly the size of a quarter, dark red, but not fully dried. Recent, I noted. Within the last 24 hours. Patrick discovered another blood droplet 10 feet away, higher up on another tree. Then Kira found spatter on low-hanging branches nearby. We began marking each discovery with small flags, creating a visible record of the blood distribution. What emerged over the next hour defied rational explanation. The blood pattern extended through our search area with no discernible trajectory or origin point. Droplets, smears, and fine spray appeared on trees, rocks, and underbrush in a scattered pattern that covered hundreds of square yards. Most disturbing were the vertical placements. Blood traces appeared on tree trunks at heights ranging from ground level to nearly 15 feet, often on smooth bark with no adjacent branches that could have been used for climbing. "This isn't possible," Patrick muttered, as we documented a particularly peculiar grouping, a semicircle of 8 distinct droplets arranged in an arc on a fallen log. The pattern's too deliberate. He was right. The distribution suggested intention rather than chance or natural causes. As though something had methodically painted the forest with Terry's blood, creating a macabre gallery that we were now cataloging. By late afternoon, we had documented over 60 distinct blood traces within our search sector. Reports from other teams indicated similar findings throughout the grid. The blood trail, if it could be called that, extended across miles of forest in all directions. As daylight began to fade, Wilson made the decision to establish a base camp near Terry's intended destination at the ridge. Teams would converge there, rest overnight, and resume the search at dawn. State police investigators were on site, processing the evidence we discovered and coordinating with forensics teams. We hiked the remaining distance to the ridge in the gathering dusk, each of us lost in private thoughts. The forest grew darker around us, and for the first time in my search and rescue career, I found myself dreading the night ahead. Base camp was established in a small clearing near the ridge, 8 tents, a central command post with radio equipment, and a perimeter illuminated by portable lights. The state police had arrived with additional resources, including forensic specialists who were processing the recovered evidence. Wilson gathered the team leaders for a situation update while the rest of the searchers set up camp and prepared meals. The atmosphere was subdued. The usual camaraderie of shared purpose had been replaced by a tense wariness. "What we know so far," Wilson began, spreading a map across the folding table. Terry Fishgold left the Kino trailhead Tuesday morning, planned for a 3-day circuit. His backpack was recovered approximately 4 miles from the trailhead, damaged and suspended in a tree. One boot was found empty, the other containing his severed right foot, located approximately 2 miles east. Blood traces have been documented throughout the search grid with no clear pattern of distribution. The facts, stated clinically, somehow made the situation more disturbing rather than less. Preliminary analysis from forensics confirms all blood samples tested so far match the same blood type as Terry, Wilson continued. Time of deposition varies, with some samples appearing fresher than others, suggesting the blood was distributed over a period of several hours, possibly continuing into today. "Any signs of other individuals in the area?" asked the leader of Team Echo. "Nothing conclusive. No camps, no vehicle tracks at alternate access points. No reported sightings of strangers from other hikers or local residents. What about the foot? I asked. Any details on how it was separated? Wilson glanced at the state police detective who had joined our briefing. The detective, a weathered man in his 50s named Osgood, cleared his throat before responding. Initial examination suggests the foot was not cleanly severed by a blade or other cutting implement, he stated. The pattern is more consistent with forceful tearing or wrenching. Bone shows irregular fracturing rather than a clean cut. The implications settled over us like a physical weight. Whatever had removed Terry's foot had done so with brute force rather than sharp precision. We're treating this as a homicide investigation, Osgood continued. Though the evidence presents unusual characteristics, we've requested additional resources, including cadaver dogs and specialized forensic teams. They'll arrive tomorrow morning. The briefing concluded with assignments for overnight security watches and plans for resuming the search at dawn. I was scheduled for the midnight to 2 a.m. watch, giving me a few hours to eat and rest beforehand. I found myself unable to eat much, despite the physical demands of the day. The images we documented, the torn backpack, the solitary boot, the impossible blood patterns, had destroyed my appetite. I forced down some trail mix and water, then retreated to my tent to review my sector notes and rest. Sleep proved elusive. The forest outside our illuminated perimeter seemed to press against the boundaries of light like an animate force. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the camp gradually quieting as others settled in for the night. Just before midnight, Patrick roused me for my watch shift. He looked haggard, his usual easy demeanor replaced by tense vigilance. All quiet, he reported. Too quiet, honestly. Haven't heard a single animal all night. I nodded, understanding his unspoken concern. Olympic National Forest typically hummed with nocturnal activity. Owls, small mammals, insects, the occasional larger predator. The absence of these sounds was as unsettling as any presence might have been. I took up my position at the northern edge of the camp perimeter, facing outward toward the dark wall of trees beyond our lights. The night was clear, stars visible in patches between the towering conifers. A waning moon provided minimal illumination, casting faint, shifting shadows as it moved between branches. The first hour of my watch passed in uneventful tension. I maintained a systematic scanning pattern, sweeping my flashlight across the forest boundary at regular intervals. Nothing moved within the beam's reach. Nothing called from the darkness beyond. At approximately 1:15 a.m. I heard it, a sharp, deliberate crack of breaking wood, perhaps 100 yards north of my position. Not the natural sound of a branch falling under its own weight, but the distinct snap of something being broken with intention. I raised my flashlight, directing the beam toward the sound's origin. The light penetrated perhaps 30 yards before dissipating into the forest's darkness. I saw nothing move, no reflection of eyes, no disturbance of foliage. Protocol dictated that I alert the camp supervisor and request backup before investigating any unusual occurrence. I reached for my radio, then hesitated. The sound, while distinct, offered insufficient cause for waking others after an exhausting day. I decided to maintain vigilance and report the incident at the shift change. 10 minutes later, another crack sounded, closer this time, perhaps 70 yards out. Again, I swept the area with my flashlight. Again, nothing visible responded to the light's intrusion. I thumbed the radio's transmit button. Base, this is Perimeter North. Possible movement in the tree line 70 yards out. Request backup for investigation. The camp supervisor acknowledged immediately and dispatched one of the state police officers to my position. Within 2 minutes, Officer Brennan joined me, his hand resting on his holstered sidearm. "What did you hear exactly?" he asked, his voice professionally measured. "Deliberate breaking of wood. 2 instances, approximately 10 minutes apart. Moving closer between occurrences." Brennan nodded, unholstering his flashlight rather than his weapon. We began a methodical examination of the forest edge beyond our light perimeter. The beams of our flashlights carved twin paths through the darkness, illuminating tree trunks, underbrush, fallen logs, all motionless, all ordinary. We had covered perhaps 40 yards of perimeter when Brennan suddenly froze, his light fixed on a point about 15 feet ahead. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. I directed my beam to converge with his. There, on the trunk of a massive Douglas fir, approximately 7 feet above ground level, was a fresh blood smear. Unlike the smaller traces we'd documented earlier, this was a broad swath, as though someone had pressed a blood-soaked cloth against the bark and dragged it downward. "That wasn't there during the day search," I stated with certainty. My team had thoroughly covered this quadrant before making camp. "Fresh," Brennan agreed, approaching cautiously. He directed his light upward, tracing the trunk's circumference. No climbing holds, no adjacent branches low enough to reach. I scanned the ground beneath the tree. The forest floor was covered with its natural layer of needles, moss, and decaying vegetation, but showed no footprints or disturbance of any kind. Nothing could reach that height without leaving ground sign, I noted, my professional analysis contradicting the evidence before my eyes. Brennan keyed his radio. "Command, this is Brennan. We've got fresh blood sign outside the north perimeter. Requesting evidence team." Within minutes, the camp had mobilized. Lights were brought to the site, photographs taken, samples collected. The blood smear measured nearly 2 feet in length and appeared to have been deposited within the past hour, still tacky to the touch when forensics tested it. Most disturbing was the confirmation that came shortly before dawn. Preliminary field testing indicated the blood matched Terry's type. "So, while we've been searching for him," Patrick whispered as we stood watching the evidence collection, "something has been continuing to spread his blood around the forest, including right outside our camp." The unspoken question hung between us. What kind of predator returns to the site of its kill, deliberately marking the territory around those searching for its victim? As dawn approached and the forest lightened incrementally from black to deep gray, I found myself studying the trees with new understanding. We weren't conducting a search anymore. We were being watched, evaluated, perhaps even stalked by something that operated according to rules I couldn't comprehend. For the first time in my search and rescue career, I feared we might need rescuing ourselves. Dawn of the third day brought reinforcements, additional state police, FBI agents specializing in wilderness crimes, and 3 teams with cadaver dogs. The expanded operation transformed our modest base camp into a hive of activity. Satellite communications equipment was established, allowing direct contact with regional headquarters and access to various databases and resources. I briefed the FBI team on our discoveries, providing detailed maps of the evidence distribution and my assessment of the anomalies we'd encountered. Special Agent Catherine Bennett, the lead investigator, listened intently without interruption. "In your professional opinion," she asked when I'd finished, "what are we dealing with here?" The question demanded a level of speculation I typically avoided. "The evidence suggests human agency," I replied carefully. "The deliberate placement of items, the consistent blood distribution patterns, the timing of discoveries, all indicate purpose rather than accident or animal predation." "Yet you note several elements that seem physically impossible," she observed. "Blood deposits at unreachable heights, no footprints despite soft forest floor, evidence appearing in previously searched areas." "I can only report what we found," I stated. "The interpretations are beyond my expertise." Bennett nodded, neither accepting nor rejecting my professional evasion. "We'll integrate your teams with ours for today's operation. Full grid search, expanded radius, with cadaver dogs taking priority in sectors where blood evidence was most concentrated." The search resumed with methodical intensity. My team was paired with an FBI tactical unit and one of the cadaver dog handlers, assigned to the northwestern quadrant where we'd found the backpack on the previous day. The forest felt different in daylight, less immediately threatening, but somehow more fundamentally wrong. Birds called occasionally from the canopy, and small creatures rustled in the underbrush, but these normal sounds seemed performative rather than natural, as though the forest were attempting to present a facade of normalcy. The cadaver dog, a Belgian Malinois named Rex, worked with focused determination, his handler interpreting the animal's responses to various scents. 3 hours into the search, Rex alerted strongly near a cluster of fallen logs. "He's got human remains," the handler confirmed. "Recent." The tactical team secured the perimeter while evidence technicians carefully examined the site. Beneath one of the logs, partially concealed by moss and forest debris, they discovered a human hand, severed at the wrist, with no signs of animal scavenging or natural decomposition. Like the foot discovered the previous day, the hand appeared to have been torn rather than cut from its owner. Forensics would later confirm it was Terry's left hand. The discovery established a pattern that grew increasingly disturbing as the day progressed. Teams across the search grid reported similar findings. Terry's remains were being discovered in pieces, distributed throughout miles of forest. A segment of forearm, part of a shoulder blade. 3 vertebrae arranged in a deliberate row on a flat rock. Each discovery shared key characteristics. The remains showed signs of forceful separation rather than cutting. They were deliberately placed rather than scattered randomly. They showed minimal animal interference despite exposure, and most were found in locations that had been thoroughly searched on previous days. By mid-afternoon, the search had yielded 17 distinct portions of Terry's remains, none larger than the forearm segment. Forensics estimated that the recovered portions represented less than 30% of his total body mass. The cadaver dogs exhibited increasingly erratic behavior as the day progressed. They would alert strongly in one area, only to lose the scent entirely a few feet away. Some became agitated, whining and circling rather than maintaining their trained search patterns. 2 handlers eventually withdrew their animals, reporting they had become too distressed to work effectively. "The scent isn't behaving normally," one handler explained to Bennett. "It's everywhere and nowhere at once. Dogs can't establish a gradient to follow." This assessment matched our experience with the blood evidence, distributed so widely and irregularly that no coherent pattern emerged. It was as though Terry's remains had been deliberately scattered to maximize the area they covered, while minimizing the possibility of complete recovery. As the day's search concluded and teams returned to the expanded base camp, a strained silence fell over the operation. The professional detachment that typically characterized such investigations had eroded in the face of evidence that defied explanation. Over dinner, which few had appetite for, William articulated what many were thinking. "It's like whatever did this wants us to find pieces, but not enough to understand what happened." The observation was unsettlingly accurate. The evidence revealed just enough to confirm Terry's death without providing any coherent explanation for its circumstances. Bennett called a strategy meeting for all team leaders at 8 p.m. The command tent was crowded with law enforcement, search and rescue professionals, and various specialists who had been consulted remotely. "We need to address the reality of our situation," Bennett began without preamble. "We have confirmed the death of Terry Fishgold through recovered remains. What we haven't established is the nature of the threat that killed him, or whether that threat remains active in the search area." No one spoke. The implication that whatever had killed Terry might pose a danger to the search teams had been privately considered by many, but not openly acknowledged until now. "Forensic analysis has yielded conflicting indicators," Bennett continued. "The damage to human tissue suggests extreme force application consistent with certain predatory animals. However, the distribution pattern and placement of evidence is consistent with human agency and intention." "You're suggesting we're looking for either an animal with human intelligence or a human with animal strength," Osgood stated flatly. "I'm suggesting we lack sufficient data to form a conclusion," Bennett replied, "and that this uncertainty represents a potential security risk to personnel." The discussion that followed was tense and inconclusive. Various theories were proposed. A deranged individual with wilderness skills, a previously undocumented predator species, even the possibility of multiple perpetrators working in coordination. None adequately explained all the evidence we'd encountered. As the meeting concluded, Bennett announced her decision. "We'll maintain the search operation for one more day, focused on recovery rather than rescue. Security protocols will be enhanced. No one works alone, no one moves beyond visual contact with their team. At sundown tomorrow, we reassess based on findings. I return to my tent afterward, documenting the day's discoveries in my field notebook. The technical language of search and rescue, coordinates, evidence classifications, environmental conditions, provided an illusion of order that the reality of our situation increasingly lacked. Outside, the forest darkness pressed against our illuminated perimeter. I found myself avoiding looking directly into that darkness, as though something might be looking back. The fourth day of the search began under leaden skies. A weather system had moved in overnight, bringing low clouds and intermittent drizzle that further dampened an already somber mood. Bennett reorganized the search patterns, concentrating resources in areas where previous evidence had been discovered, while maintaining security teams at the perimeter. My assignment placed me with Patrick, Kira, and 2 FBI tactical specialists in the eastern quadrant, where the severed foot had been found on the second day. We moved methodically through our sector, the cadaver dogs working ahead of our line to indicate potential discoveries. The forest felt weighted with moisture and shadow. Droplets collected on needles and leaves, falling in irregular patterns that mimicked footsteps among the underbrush. Visibility was reduced to roughly 50 yards in the mist, creating isolated pockets of searchable terrain beyond which details blurred into gray obscurity. 3 hours into the day's operation, one of the dogs alerted near a small seasonal stream, now swollen with recent rainfall. The handler confirmed a human remains scent, and our team converged on the location. The stream ran through a narrow gully, its banks steep but navigable. The dog's interest focused on the eastern bank, where a tangle of exposed roots created a natural hollow beneath an ancient cedar. The tactical specialists secured the area while Patrick and I carefully approached the site. The hollow was approximately 3 feet deep, dark, and partially filled with accumulated forest debris. Water from the stream had begun to seep into its lower section. I directed my flashlight into the recess, illuminating what at first appeared to be a bundle of sodden cloth. As my eyes adjusted, the true nature of the discovery became apparent. Terry's torso, from sternum to pelvis without limbs or head, had been wedged into the hollow. Unlike the other remains we'd discovered, this portion showed signs of rudimentary concealment. Leaves, twigs, and moss had been piled around it, creating a crude attempt at disguise. "It's been placed deliberately," Patrick noted, his voice professional despite the grimness of the discovery. "Someone wanted this found eventually, but not immediately." I relayed the discovery to command while evidence technicians photographed and documented the scene. The forensic pathologist who examined the remains noted several anomalies that further complicated our understanding of what had happened to Terry. "The tissue separation shows the same tearing pattern as the other remains," she explained during the preliminary field assessment. "But there's something else here. Post-mortem interference that doesn't match animal activity or natural decomposition." The pathologist pointed to several areas on the torso where the tissue appeared to have been manipulated. "It's as though something examined the internal structures, not feeding behavior, more like curiosity." The implication was disturbing on multiple levels. Whatever had killed Terry hadn't simply dismembered him for practical purposes, predation, concealment, trophy-taking, but had apparently studied his remains with some form of methodical interest. By mid-afternoon, the search had yielded several additional discoveries: smaller tissue samples, a portion of jaw, 3 fingers found arranged in a straight line atop a moss-covered boulder. Each piece added to the inventory of Terry's remains without contributing to our understanding of what had happened to him. At 4:30 p.m., as daylight began to fade and the drizzle intensified into steady rain, Bennett made the decision to conclude the active search operation. "We've recovered approximately 60% of the remains," she announced during the final field briefing. "Continued search under deteriorating weather conditions poses increasing risk to personnel with diminishing probability of significant new discoveries." No one protested the decision. The search had evolved beyond its initial purpose of finding a missing hiker into something more complex and disturbing, a futile attempt to assemble a coherent explanation from fragments of evidence that actively resisted interpretation. The dismantling of the base camp proceeded with efficient solemnity. Equipment was packed, evidence was secured for transport, and search teams prepared for the hike back to the trailhead. State police would maintain a presence in the area for several more days, and trail access would remain restricted pending completion of the investigation. As I packed my gear, I found myself drawn to the edge of our clearing, gazing into the forest that had become both crime scene and adversary over the past 4 days. The trees stood impassive in the rain, revealing nothing of what they had witnessed. Patrick joined me, following my gaze into the dripping foliage. "You know we're leaving with more questions than answers," he observed quietly. I nodded. "The official report will cite animal predation with unusual characteristics. They'll speculate about a rogue bear or cougar with aberrant behavior patterns. They'll note the distribution of remains is consistent with scavenger activity. And they'll be wrong about all of it." "What do you think happened?" I considered the question carefully. My professional reputation was built on evidence-based assessment, not speculation or imagination. Yet everything about this search had challenged the boundaries of my experience and understanding. "I think something in these woods operates according to rules we don't comprehend," I finally replied. "Something that wanted us to find pieces of Terry without ever understanding what happened to him. Something that watched us searching, that moved around us, that might have been within reach the entire time." Patrick didn't immediately dismiss my statement as I'd half expected. Instead, he continued looking into the forest with renewed wariness. "Whatever it was," he said after a long moment, "I hope to God it stays here." The official investigation into Terry Fishgold's death continued for 11 months, before being classified as an unsolved homicide with animal predation as a contributing factor. The forensic evidence, while extensive, yielded no conclusive identification of either human perpetrators or specific animal predators. The case file noted several anomalous characteristics that resisted conventional explanation, but these were ultimately attributed to the wilderness conditions, incomplete evidence recovery, and post-mortem scavenger activity. Terry's recovered remains were released to his wife for cremation in the spring of 1992. For those of us who had participated in the search, the official conclusions were an unsatisfying fiction, a convenient narrative that allowed the case to be filed away without acknowledging its fundamental strangeness. I remained with the Pacific Northwest Search and Rescue Unit for another 2 years after the Fishgold operation, but the experience had fundamentally altered my relationship with the wilderness I'd once considered a challenging but ultimately comprehensible environment. The after effects rippled through our team in various ways. Patrick transferred to an urban emergency response unit 6 months later, citing family reasons, but privately acknowledging he no longer felt comfortable in deep forest operations. Kira continued with search and rescue, but refused assignments in the Olympic National Forest, developing a specialized focus on coastal operations instead. William suffered a nervous breakdown during a routine training exercise when separated from his team for less than 30 minutes. He left search and rescue entirely, moving to Arizona where, he once told me, the desert doesn't hide things the way forests do. Most disturbing was Hector's disappearance 3 years later during a solo hiking trip in the North Cascades. The search operation found his equipment scattered across 2 miles of wilderness in a pattern that triggered immediate, horrible recognition for those of us who had worked the Fishgold case. His remains were never recovered. I left search and rescue in 1993, accepting a position with the Forest Service that kept me primarily at a desk, rather than in the field. The decision wasn't conscious avoidance, so much as a gradual recognition that my effectiveness had been compromised by what I'd experienced. Over the years, I researched similar cases across the Pacific Northwest and beyond. Instances where experienced outdoors people vanished in wilderness areas, where remains were recovered in inexplicable distributions, where evidence contradicted natural explanations. I found more than I expected, often buried in local newspaper archives, or mentioned as footnotes in broader studies of wilderness dangers. I kept the map from the Fishgold search, with its meticulous documentation of where each blood trace, each body part had been discovered. Sometimes, late at night, I would spread it across my desk and study the pattern, or lack thereof, trying to discern some meaning in the seemingly random distribution. On the 10th anniversary of the search, I returned to the Canoe River trailhead. I hadn't planned to hike the trail again. I merely wanted to see the forest entrance in daylight, to reassure myself that it was just a place, trees, underbrush, the natural processes of growth and decay. I sat in my car for nearly an hour, watching hikers enter and exit the trail with casual confidence. They saw beauty where I now perceived only concealment, vitality where I sensed patient observation. The forest remained as it had always been, yet my perception of it had been permanently altered. As I prepared to leave, an older man approached my vehicle, a Forest Service ranger I didn't recognize. He tapped on my window, and I lowered it with some reluctance. "Thought that might be you," he said. "You worked the Fishgold case back in '91. I nodded, surprised to be recognized. "I was with local law enforcement then," he continued. "Spent 3 weeks processing evidence after your team left. Never made sense of half of it." "The official report seemed to make sense of it," I replied, unable to keep a trace of bitterness from my voice. He snorted. "Official reports make sense of everything, don't they? Doesn't make them true." We were silent for a moment, two aging men who had glimpsed something neither could explain. "Had 3 hikers go missing last month," he said finally. 2 miles north of where you found that backpack. Search teams found clothing, equipment, some blood. No bodies yet. The information settled like a stone in my stomach. "Any unusual distributions?" "High up in trees, separated by miles. No animal tracks." He met my eyes directly. "Just like before." I nodded, understanding what he wasn't explicitly stating. The pattern was repeating. Whatever had taken Terry Fishgold was still active in the forest, still operating according to its incomprehensible rules. "What do you think it is?" he asked. His voice lowered, though no one was nearby to overhear. I considered my response carefully. In the decades since the search, I'd developed various theories, each more implausible than the last, none fully satisfying. Whatever stalked the Olympic wilderness defied categorization within my understanding of the natural world. "I think some places in this world have their own rules," I finally answered. "Rules we glimpse only when we've already violated them. I think Terry crossed some boundary without knowing it existed." The ranger nodded slowly. "Been doing this job 30 years. Used to think I understood these woods." "You still come to work," I observed. "Someone has to warn them," he replied simply, gesturing toward the trailhead where hikers continued to enter the forest with casual confidence. "Even if they don't listen. Even if we don't have the words to explain what we're warning them about." I drove away that day with the realization that the Fishgold case would never truly be closed. Not for those of us who had experienced it firsthand, and not for the forest that held its secrets. Whatever had happened in those woods in the summer of 1991 continued to happen, would perhaps always happen, beyond our capacity to prevent or fully comprehend. In my dreams, I still walk those search grids. I still find blood in impossible places, evidence that defies explanation, fragments that never assemble into a coherent whole. I still feel watched by something that moves through the trees according to rules I cannot fathom. And sometimes, in those dreams, I look down to discover that I'm following a trail of my own blood, scattered behind me like breadcrumbs leading to a truth I both seek and dread. Some mysteries, I've learned, are not meant to be solved. They exist not to yield answers, but to remind us that our understanding of the world remains fundamentally incomplete. The forest keeps its secrets, and we who have glimpsed them carry our own silence in return. Terry Fishgold is gone. The thing that took him remains, and the trees stand witness to both, indifferent to our need for explanation or closure. The search continues, but only in memory now, and in the forest, where something still waits, patient and unknowable, for those who stray too far from the trail. The decision to move to the mountains came after 25 years of corporate servitude had finally broken my spirit. By March of 2012, I had accumulated enough savings to purchase a modest cabin, nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains of northern Georgia. At 52, I craved the solitude that only nature could provide, away from the constant notifications and deadlines that had dominated my existence. The property listing described it as secluded and peaceful, but these words failed to capture the profound isolation that awaited me. 5 acres of densely wooded land surrounded the cabin, which perched precariously on a steep mountainside. The nearest neighbor was nearly 2 miles away as the crow flies, and nearly 4 by the winding gravel road that connected our properties. My wife Judith supported the move but couldn't join me immediately. Her position at the hospital required a proper transition period, meaning I would spend the first month alone in our new home. The prospect didn't bother me. I had always been comfortable with solitude. The cabin itself was a sturdy structure built in the 1970s by a retired engineer with a penchant for over-engineering. The foundation was concrete, the walls thick pine, and the roof recently replaced. Inside, the open floor plan featured a kitchen and living area dominated by a stone fireplace, with 2 bedrooms and a bathroom tucked into the back. The front of the house boasted floor-to-ceiling windows that offered breathtaking views of the valley below. My first impression upon arriving was how the mountains seemed to swallow sound. The city's constant hum was replaced by a silence so profound it felt almost physical. That first afternoon, I stood on the front porch, listening to absolutely nothing, and felt the weight of 25 years lifting from my shoulders. The real estate agent, an older woman named Dorothy, had been apologetic about the driveway, a quarter-mile stretch of gravel that wound through the forest before connecting to what locals generously called the main road. In reality, it was just another gravel path, barely maintained by the county. "You'll need something with 4-wheel drive for winter," she had advised. "And even then, you might find yourself snowed in occasionally." I had nodded, secretly relishing the idea of forced isolation. As I unpacked my modest belongings that first evening, watching the sun set behind the distant peaks, I couldn't imagine anything disturbing the peace I had found. I was wrong. The first week passed without incident. I established a routine. Mornings spent exploring the property, afternoons dedicated to making the cabin more comfortable, and evenings reading by the fireplace. The complete absence of noise pollution allowed me to sleep more soundly than I had in decades. I became acquainted with the local wildlife. Deer that grazed at the edge of my clearing each morning, a family of raccoons that investigated my garbage cans despite my best efforts to secure them, and countless birds whose songs formed a natural symphony each dawn. My property extended deep into the forest, bordered by a small stream to the west and another private property to the east. The previous owner had maintained a rudimentary network of trails, which I began clearing and exploring. On the 3rd day, I discovered an old hunting blind about half a mile from the house, overlooking a natural clearing. It appeared abandoned for years, with rotting floorboards and vegetation reclaiming the structure. The isolation suited me perfectly. My only connection to the outside world was a satellite internet connection that worked when the weather permitted, and a cell phone that captured signal only on the highest point of my property, a rocky outcropping I named Communication Hill. I made weekly trips to the nearest town, a 30-minute drive down the mountain to stock up on supplies. The local grocery store doubled as a hardware store and general meeting place for the sparse population. During these visits, I exchanged pleasantries with the locals but never lingered. I was there for solitude, not to build a social network. By the end of the first week, I had mapped most of my property and begun repairs on the cabin's aging deck. Physical labor felt therapeutic after years behind a desk, and I fell into bed each night pleasantly exhausted. On day 8, I received my first visitor, a forest ranger named Bennett who stopped by to introduce himself. He was a tall, weathered man with a gray beard and eyes that seemed to look through rather than at you. "Just checking in on the new resident," he explained, declining my offer to come inside. "Winter's over, but spring can be tricky. Flash floods, fallen trees blocking roads. Best to be prepared." "I appreciate the warning," I replied. "I've stocked up on essentials." Bennett nodded, his gaze drifting to the forest behind me. "These mountains have been here long before us and will be here long after. They don't much care for human comfort. With that cryptic statement, he handed me a card with his number and departed, his Forest Service truck grinding down my gravel driveway. That night, I experienced my first storm in the mountains. The rain lashed against the windows with impressive force, and thunder echoed between the peaks with a resonance impossible in the flatlands. I stood at the glass wall facing the valley, watching lightning illuminate the landscape in brilliant flashes, feeling wonderfully small against nature's display. When I finally went to bed, I slept soundly, lulled by the rhythm of the rain on the roof. In retrospect, those first peaceful days were the mountain's way of lowering my guard before revealing their true nature. The subtle shift began on the 12th day. I awoke to find the front door ajar, swinging gently in the morning breeze. I was certain I had locked it the night before, a habit ingrained from decades of city living. I checked the house thoroughly, finding nothing missing or disturbed. Must not have pulled it closed properly, I muttered to myself, dismissing the incident. That same afternoon, while clearing brush from one of the more overgrown trails, I experienced an unsettling sensation of being watched. The forest surrounding me seemed suddenly foreign and hostile. I paused, wiping sweat from my brow, and scanned the trees. Nothing moved except the wind through the leaves. Yet the feeling persisted, raising the fine hairs on my arms and neck. After 10 minutes of standing perfectly still, listening intently to the forest sounds, I packed up my tools and returned to the cabin earlier than planned. The following day, I discovered fresh footprints in the mud near my woodpile, too large to be my own. They appeared to approach from the forest, circle the stack of logs, and return the way they came. I followed them to the edge of the tree line, where they disappeared into the underbrush. My first instinct was to call the police, but I reconsidered. What would I report? That someone walked near my cabin? In rural Georgia, trespassing wasn't uncommon. Hunters tracking game, hikers who'd strayed from public lands. Nothing was stolen or damaged. Still, I began locking the doors even during the day. That night, I woke abruptly at 2:18 a.m., according to the glowing numbers of my bedside clock. The cabin was silent, yet I felt absolutely certain something had awakened me. I lay motionless, straining to hear anything unusual. After several minutes of nothing but the creaking of the cabin settling, I rose and checked each window and door. All were secure. Outside, the forest was a wall of darkness beyond the feeble reach of my porch light. As I stood at the front window, peering into the night, I noticed a strange configuration of shadows at the edge of the light's reach. Something seemed to move. A slight shift in the darkness that didn't match the wind's pattern through the trees. I flipped on the exterior floods, bathing the front yard in harsh light. Nothing was there. Yet as I turned the floods off and prepared to return to bed, I could have sworn I saw something retreat into the darkness. A shape moving with deliberate purpose rather than the random motion of shadows. Sleep evaded me for the remainder of the night. I sat in the living room with a cup of tea, watching the darkness through the windows until dawn gradually reclaimed the forest. The next morning, I discovered more footprints, this time on the front porch and around the perimeter of the cabin. They were the same size as before, but now they formed a complete circuit of my home, pausing at each window. The implications disturbed me deeply. Someone had been studying my home, looking in at me while I slept. I drove to town that day and purchased additional locks for the doors and windows, along with a shotgun from the local hunting supply store. The owner, a bald man with a friendly smile, didn't question my sudden interest in home security. "Living alone up in these mountains, I'd do the same," he said, showing me how to load and clean the weapon. "Probably just some curious animals, but better safe than sorry." I nodded, not mentioning the distinctly human footprints. By the time I returned to the cabin, I had half convinced myself that my imagination was running wild, a city dweller unused to the natural sounds and movements of the forest. The mountains had a way of playing tricks on the mind. This comforting rationalization lasted exactly 3 days. On my 18th night at the cabin, Judith called to say her departure would be delayed another 2 weeks. I expressed my disappointment, but assured her I was doing fine on my own. We chatted about her work, my progress on the cabin renovations, and the local wildlife I'd observed. I didn't mention the footprints or my growing unease. After hanging up, I prepared a simple dinner and settled in with a book by the fireplace. The evening passed uneventfully until I retired to bed around 10:30 p.m. The night was unusually still, no wind rustling the trees, no distant calls of nocturnal creatures. The silence itself seemed to have substance, pressing against the windows of the cabin. I awoke suddenly at 1:07 a.m., instantly alert. Something had disturbed my sleep. A sound out of place in the night's stillness. I lay motionless, ears straining. For several minutes, nothing broke the silence. Then it came. A knock at the front door. Not a tentative tap, but a firm, deliberate knock that resonated through the cabin. 3 distinct impacts, evenly spaced. The rational part of my mind immediately sought explanations. A ranger checking on me, a lost hiker seeking assistance, a neighbor with an emergency. But these rationales couldn't account for the complete absence of vehicle sounds. My driveway's gravel announced approaching cars long before they reached the cabin. I slid silently from bed and retrieved the shotgun from under it. The wood was cool against my palms as I loaded it with trembling hands. Moving to the bedroom doorway, I called out, "Who's there?" No response. The silence stretched for nearly a minute before the knocking resumed, louder, more insistent. The same pattern, 3 firm knocks. The front door featured a large glass panel that offered a view of the porch and yard beyond. From my position, I couldn't see who stood at the door without exposing myself. The thought of approaching the glass with someone on the other side made my heart hammer against my ribs. "This is private property," I shouted, trying to project confidence. "I'm armed. Identify yourself." Again, no response, just the oppressive silence. I steeled myself and moved into the hallway, keeping the shotgun leveled. The floorboards creaked beneath my weight as I approached the door. Through the glass, I could see the porch was empty. I lowered the gun slightly, confusion momentarily overtaking fear. Then the knocking came again, but not from the front door. It came from the bedroom window behind me. I whirled around, nearly losing my balance. The knocking continued, migrating to each window of the cabin in turn: front, side, bedroom, bathroom, kitchen. A methodical circling of my home, as if testing for weaknesses. With shaking hands, I fumbled for my cell phone and dialed 911, only to find no signal. Of course, I needed to be on Communication Hill for service. The knocking stopped as suddenly as it had begun. In its place came a new sound, the soft scrape of something moving along the outer walls, circling the cabin just as the knocking had done. It moved with a deliberate slowness that suggested a taunting familiarity with my fear. I positioned myself in the center of the living room, back to the fireplace, shotgun aimed at the front door. From this vantage point, I could see most of the cabin's interior. The scraping continued its circuit, pausing occasionally as if considering an entry point. For 3 hours, this psychological warfare continued. Sometimes knocking, sometimes scraping. Sometimes complete silence that proved more terrifying than either. During one of the silent periods, I heard the distinct sound of footsteps on the cabin's roof. Measured, deliberate steps directly above my head. At 4:21 a.m., everything stopped. The pre-dawn stillness returned as if nothing had happened. I remained frozen in position, shotgun ready, until the first light of morning filtered through the windows. When I finally gathered the courage to look outside, I found the muddy ground around my cabin crisscrossed with footprints. The same large prints I'd seen earlier. They approached from the forest to the north, circled the entire structure multiple times, and then retreated in the same direction. I followed them to the tree line, shotgun clutched in white-knuckled hands, but lost the trail where the forest floor became a carpet of pine needles. The day after the visitation, I drove to town in a state of exhausted paranoia, constantly checking my rearview mirror. My first stop was the sheriff's office, a modest building adjacent to the town's single traffic light. Sheriff Donovan was a compact man with silver-streaked hair and a weathered face that suggested decades of outdoor work. He listened patiently as I recounted the previous night's events, occasionally jotting notes on a legal pad. "And you didn't see anyone?" he asked when I finished. "No, just heard them. And the footprints." "Did you take photos of these prints?" I hadn't, a fact that now seemed incredibly stupid. The sheriff nodded, unsurprised by my oversight. "Terror does that," he said simply. "Makes you forget the obvious. I'll send Deputy Wilson up with you to check things out." Deputy Wilson proved to be a young woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She photographed the footprints around my cabin and took measurements. Her expression remained neutral, but I caught a flicker of concern when she examined the pattern. "They definitely circled your house," she confirmed. "Multiple times. Size 12 boot, probably male given the depth of impression. Could be a hunter trespassing, could be teenagers looking to scare the new guy. Hard to say." "At 1 a.m, I asked. Wilson shrugged. "People do strange things for their own reasons." She handed me a card. "Call if it happens again. We'll increase patrols on the main road, but..." She didn't need to finish. We both knew the chances of catching someone in such remote terrain were slim. After she left, I drove to the local hardware store and purchased motion-activated floodlights, which I installed at each corner of the cabin. I also bought a battery-powered emergency radio, additional locks, and window bars for the bedroom. That evening, I visited the only establishment in town that could reasonably be called a restaurant, a family-owned diner serving classic American comfort food. I wasn't hungry, but I needed to be around people. The waitress, an older woman named Betty, recognized me as the new guy up on Ridgeline Road. As she refilled my coffee, I casually asked if she'd heard of anyone experiencing unusual visitors in the area. Betty's hand paused mid-pour. "What kind of visitors?" "Someone knocking on doors late at night, circling houses." She set the coffee pot down. "You had a night visitor." It wasn't a question. "You know about this?" Betty glanced around the nearly empty diner before sliding into the booth across from me. "It happens every few years. Always to newcomers. Always folks living alone in the outer properties." "Who is it?" "Nobody knows for certain. Some say it's a drifter who lives in the caves up in the higher elevations. Others think it's someone local with a mean streak. My grandmother used to say it was the mountain itself, testing newcomers." "That's not particularly helpful," I said, unable to keep the edge from my voice. Betty shrugged. "No, I suppose it's not. But I can tell you this. In the 30 years I've lived here, no one's ever been hurt by the night visitor. Scared half to death, yes. Actually harmed, no. Has anyone ever seen them? Just glimpses. Tall figure, they say. Always at night. Always keeping to the shadows." "And the police?" "Sheriffs investigated every time. Never found anything conclusive." I left the diner with more questions than answers, and a growing sense that the locals viewed these incidents as some kind of rural initiation ritual, not worth serious concern. That night, I barricaded myself in the cabin, shotgun within reach, floodlights primed to illuminate any approach. I didn't expect to sleep, but exhaustion claimed me around midnight. No knocking came. No scraping. No footsteps. Just the ordinary sounds of a mountain night. Distant owls, the occasional rustle of nocturnal creatures, the house settling into itself. For 4 more nights, nothing unusual occurred. I began to wonder if the entire incident had been magnified by my urban paranoia, a mind unused to rural solitude, constructing threats from natural phenomena. Then came the 5th night, and with it, a revelation. The pattern was becoming clear. 5 nights of peace followed by activity. I hadn't recognized it after the first visitation, because I'd attributed the footprints and strange sensations to separate incidents. Now I understood. The presence was establishing a rhythm, perhaps intended to lull me into a false sense of security before each appearance. I prepared accordingly. On the 5th night of peace, I didn't go to bed. Instead, I positioned myself in the darkened living room with a clear view of the approaches to the cabin. The shotgun rested across my knees, and a night vision monocular, an expensive hunting tool I'd purchased in town, sat on the table beside me. At precisely 1:07 a.m., the exact same time as the previous incident, the motion-activated floodlights blazed to life, bathing the front yard in harsh illumination. I raised the monocular to my eye, scanning the tree line. Initially, I saw nothing. Then, at the furthest reach of the light, something moved. A figure retreating into the darkness. I caught only a glimpse. Tall, dressed in dark clothing, moving with a fluidity that suggested familiarity with the terrain. The floodlights, which should have been a deterrent, seemed instead to have forced a change in tactics. No knocking came. Instead, I detected movement at the edge of the light's reach, circling, always just beyond clear visibility. For hours, this continued. The figure moving in a wide perimeter around my cabin, occasionally triggering the lights but never approaching closely enough for identification. It was studying the new security measures, adapting its approach. Near dawn, the pattern changed. The figure retreated to the forest edge and remained stationary, visible only as a darker shape against the pre-dawn darkness. It seemed to be watching, waiting. For what? I couldn't fathom. As the sky lightened, I raised the monocular for one final look. The figure was gone, but something had been left behind, an object at the edge of my clearing. When full daylight arrived, I ventured out with the shotgun to investigate. A small cairn of stones had been constructed, 7 smooth river rocks balanced in a precise tower. The arrangement was clearly deliberate, not a natural formation. I circled it cautiously, looking for any clue to its purpose. The top stone had been positioned so that one flat side faced directly toward my cabin. Upon closer inspection, I discovered something had been etched into the stone's surface. A crude symbol resembling a spiral with a line bisecting it. The marking appeared freshly carved, tiny stone fragments still clinging to the grooves. I photographed the cairn from multiple angles before dismantling it, half expecting to find something hidden beneath the stones. There was nothing, just compressed earth where the lowest rock had sat. That afternoon, I drove to town and showed the photos to Sheriff Donovan, who studied them with a frown. "This is new," he admitted. "The night visitor usually just makes noise, leaves footprints. Never left any markers before." "What does it mean?" I asked. "Could be nothing. Could be someone playing an elaborate joke. Or they're escalating, becoming bolder." He rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "I'd offer to put a deputy on your property, but frankly, we don't have the manpower." I left the sheriff's office feeling distinctly unprotected by local law enforcement. On impulse, I stopped at the town library, a small brick building with an antiquated computer system and a surprisingly well-maintained local history section. The librarian, an elderly man named Gregory, listened to my situation with academic interest. When I described the symbol, his eyebrows rose slightly. "May I see the photograph?" he asked. I showed him the clearest image on my phone. Gregory studied it for a long moment before retrieving a large leather-bound volume from a locked cabinet behind the desk. "This is a compilation of local folklore and history," he explained, carefully turning brittle pages. "Compiled in the 1930s by a WPA worker documenting Appalachian culture." He found what he was looking for and turned the book toward me. On the yellowed page was a hand-drawn illustration nearly identical to the symbol on the stone. "It's called a watcher mark," Gregory said. "According to local legend, it was used by mountain people to designate outsiders who were under observation by the community, sometimes as a warning, sometimes as a prelude to more direct action." "What kind of action?" I asked, mouth suddenly dry. Gregory closed the book carefully. "The accounts vary. In most cases, it was simply a signal for the community to shun the marked individual. In more extreme instances..." He paused. "Let's just say the mountains have their own justice system, historically speaking." "You're saying someone from the community is targeting me?" "I'm saying this symbol has historical significance in these mountains. Whether the person using it understands that significance is another question entirely." I left the library with photocopies of the relevant pages and a growing certainty that my night visitor was not some random drifter, but someone with connection to the area's history and traditions. That night, I didn't wait for the visitor to come to me. I decided to change the dynamic. Armed with the shotgun, a powerful flashlight, and a handheld GPS, I positioned myself in the hunting blind I'd discovered earlier. It offered a clear view of the cabin while providing concealment. My plan was simple: observe who or what approached my home, document their presence, and if necessary, confront them from a position of advantage. I settled in at sunset, prepared for a long night of surveillance. Hours passed uneventfully. Periodically, I checked the GPS to ensure I could find my way back in darkness if needed. The night grew increasingly cold, my breath forming small clouds in the hunting blind. At 1:05 a.m., 2 minutes before the expected time of appearance, I detected movement at the forest edge opposite my position. A tall figure emerged from the trees, moving with extraordinary stealth. Even watching intently, I could barely track their progress through the underbrush. The figure paused at the edge of the clearing, surveying the cabin. It appeared to be a man, dressed in dark clothing that blended with the forest. Something about his posture suggested tension, a predator assessing potential danger. After several minutes of observation, he moved toward the cabin, triggering the floodlights. Rather than retreating, he froze, becoming a stark silhouette in the artificial glare. He was indeed tall, well over 6 feet, and wore what appeared to be a canvas jacket and work pants. A dark hat obscured his features. For nearly 5 minutes, he remained motionless in the light, as if deliberately allowing himself to be seen. Then, with deliberate slowness, he raised one hand and made a gesture toward the cabin, a circular motion followed by a slashing movement. The gesture completed, he turned and looked directly toward the hunting blind where I was concealed. Though I couldn't see his face clearly, I felt his awareness of my presence with absolute certainty. He knew I was watching. Abandoning stealth, I raised the shotgun and chambered around, the mechanical sound carrying clearly in the night air. The figure didn't flinch or flee. Instead, he nodded slowly, a deliberate acknowledgement, before turning and walking unhurriedly back into the forest. I remained in the blind, shotgun trained on the spot where he disappeared, until dawn broke. He didn't return. When daylight finally arrived, I approached the spot where he had stood. The ground revealed clear boot prints, the same size and pattern I'd seen around my cabin previously. Beside them, something gleamed in the morning light. A small metallic object had been pressed into the soft earth. An old coin. I carefully extracted it, brushing away the dirt. It appeared to be a silver dollar, dated 1899, with a small hole drilled near the edge. The hole suggested it had once been worn as a pendant or charm. This tangible evidence renewed my determination to identify the visitor. I photographed the coin and the footprints before returning to the cabin to prepare for a trip to town. At the sheriff's office, Donovan examined the coin with interest. "Old coins have significance in mountain folklore," he explained. "They're said to ward off evil or bring protection. The fact that it's from 1899 is interesting. That's the year of the Wilson Hollow incident." "What incident?" Donovan hesitated. "A dark chapter in local history. A community of outsiders settled in Wilson Hollow, about 5 miles from your place. They weren't welcomed by the established families. After several months of escalating tensions, the settlement was burned. Official records call it an accident, but..." He shrugged. "Local stories say differently." "You think my visitor is connecting me to this somehow?" "I think someone's trying to communicate in a language you don't understand." He handed back the coin. "The question is whether they're trying to warn you or threaten you." "How do I find out which?" "You could leave," Donovan suggested. "Many do, after experiencing the night visitor." "And if I don't want to leave?" The sheriff studied me thoughtfully. "Then you need to speak with someone who understands the old ways. There's a woman named Eleanor Ridgway who lives up on Pine Mountain. She's the closest thing we have to a local historian. If anyone can interpret what's happening, it's her." Finding Eleanor proved challenging. She lived without a phone at the end of a barely passable dirt track. When I finally located her home, a well-maintained cabin nearly a century old, I was greeted by a spry woman in her 70s with alert eyes and a directness that bypassed all social niceties. "You're the new one on Ridgeline Road," she stated before I could introduce myself. "The one with the night visitor." News traveled fast in small communities. I didn't bother asking how she knew. "I need to understand what's happening," I said. Eleanor gestured me inside. The cabin's interior was an eclectic mix of traditional Appalachian crafts and modern conveniences. She indicated a chair at a worn kitchen table and sat opposite me. "Show me what you've brought," she said. I placed the coin on the table between us. Eleanor didn't touch it, merely studied it with narrowed eyes. "Where was this found?" I explained the previous night's encounter in detail. Eleanor listened without interruption, her expression unchanging. "The visitor is testing you," she said finally. "The watching, the circling, the marks, all tests. The coin is the final piece." "Testing me for what?" "To see if you belong." She tapped the coin with one finger. "This particular coin has history. It belonged to a man named Joseph Keegan, the last outsider to successfully integrate into the mountain community after being tested. That was in 1947. "How do you know that?" "Because Joseph was my father." She picked up the coin, turning it over in her fingers. "After his death, this coin disappeared from our family collection. I always wondered where it went. So the person testing me stole this coin, or inherited it from whoever did." She handed the coin back to me. "The fact that it was given to you is significant. It means you're being offered a choice." "What choice?" "Stay and become part of the mountain, or leave and remain a stranger. The old families have their ways of protecting what they consider theirs. The night visitor is their messenger." "Who is he?" I pressed. Eleanor smiled thinly. "That's not my information to share. But I can tell you this. He'll come one more time. When he does, your response will determine whether you find peace here or not." I returned to the cabin with Eleanor's words echoing in my mind. The coin felt heavy in my pocket, a tangible connection to a tradition I was only beginning to comprehend. According to Eleanor, the third visit would come exactly 5 nights after the second, maintaining the established pattern. I spent those days in preparation, not for confrontation, but for communication. I needed to demonstrate my respect for the land and its traditions without surrendering my right to be there. Eleanor had given me specific instructions for what mountain people called making peace with the watching. On the 5th night, I didn't hide or arm myself. Instead, I set 2 chairs on the front porch facing each other. Between them, I placed a small table with 2 glasses and a bottle of locally distilled whiskey, a specific brand Eleanor had recommended, produced by one of the old families. As 1 a.m. approached, I took my seat and waited, the coin placed deliberately on the table beside the whiskey. The night was clear, a 3/4 moon providing enough illumination to see the edge of the forest without artificial light. I had disabled the motion sensors. At precisely 1:07 a.m., the figure emerged from the trees. He paused at the forest edge, observing the setup on the porch. For several long minutes, neither of us moved, a tableau of tension and possibility. Finally, he approached, moving with the same fluid grace I'd observed before. As he drew closer, details emerged. A weathered face with a gray beard, deep-set eyes under the brim of a worn hat, hands that showed decades of manual labor. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps, studying me without expression. "I've spoken with Eleanor Ridgway," I said, breaking the silence. "I understand this is a test." The man nodded almost imperceptibly. "I respect the traditions of this place," I continued, "and I wish to live here in peace. Not as an intruder, but as a caretaker." I gestured to the empty chair across from me. For a moment I thought he would turn and disappear back into the forest. Instead, he slowly ascended the steps and stood beside the offered seat. "Joseph Keegan's coin," he said, his voice rough from disuse or age. "Eleanor told you its meaning?" "That it represents a choice. belonging or remaining separate. He nodded and finally sat. I poured 2 fingers of whiskey into each glass and slid one toward him. He made no move to take it. "This land has memory," he said. "It remembers those who treated it well and those who didn't. The people are the same. I intend to treat both with respect. Intentions are easy, living them is harder." He finally picked up the glass, studying the amber liquid. "Why here? Why these mountains?" It was the question I'd expected, the one Eleanor had warned would come. My answer would determine everything. "Because I don't want to change this place," I said carefully. "I want it to change me." He considered this, then raised his glass slightly. To honest words. We drank. The whiskey burned pleasantly, warming my chest. "You have questions," he stated. "Many. But I'll start with the most pressing. Will you continue to visit in the night?" A ghost of a smile crossed his weathered face. "Not in the same way. My watching is done." "And the result?" "You'll stay. Whether you belong, that takes time to prove." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small wooden object, which he placed on the table. It was a carving of a bear, expertly crafted from a single piece of wood, its surface polished by handling. "My father made this, and his father before him. It's a token of the mountains. Keep it visible in your home. Those who understand will recognize it." I picked up the carving, feeling its surprising weight. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. Accepting the watching is just the beginning. These mountains demand much from those who choose them." We finished our drinks in silence. When his glass was empty, he stood and extended his hand. I rose and shook it, feeling calluses that spoke of decades of hard labor. "My name is Samuel," he said. "Most folks call me Ridge Sam. If you need guidance, ask for me in town. I've been there several times. No one mentioned you. They wouldn't, until now." He released my hand. "The old ways aren't dead, just quiet. Now you've been seen. Now you can see too." With that cryptic statement, he descended the steps and walked away, not toward the forest, but down my driveway. Minutes later, I heard the distant sound of an engine starting, the first confirmation that my visitor used mechanical transportation. The night visitor never returned to my cabin. Instead, I began to notice subtle changes in how I was treated in town. Shopkeepers who had been politely distant became conversational. I received invitations to community events that hadn't been mentioned before. Dorothy, the real estate agent, stopped by with a homemade pie and admitted she'd been worried about my adjustment period. 2 weeks later, Judith finally joined me at the cabin. By then, I had integrated into the community enough to understand that our acceptance wasn't guaranteed by my interaction with Ridge Sam. It was merely the beginning of a longer process. The mountains had their own rhythm, their own rules. Those who respected them found peace. Those who didn't eventually left. The night visitor was simply the first guardian of a tradition older than any living memory, ensuring that newcomers understood the choice before them. On our first evening together in our new home, I showed Judith the bear carving, now prominently displayed on our mantel. I told her a modified version of events, enough to explain its significance without alarming her. "The locals have their traditions," I concluded. "This is a sign that we're welcome." She examined the carving with artist's eyes, appreciating its craftsmanship. "It's beautiful. Did you meet the carver?" I thought of Ridge Sam, of our midnight conversation, of the ancient coin and its meaning. "Yes," I replied. "I believe we understand each other now." That night, I slept soundly for the first time since moving to the mountains. The forest had tested me, and I had passed the first trial. What future tests awaited remained to be seen, but I faced them without fear. The mountains had shared their first secret with me. In time, perhaps they would share more. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, the kind of day where nothing extraordinary is meant to happen. I stared at the return address, a law firm I'd never heard of from a small town in Montana that might as well have been on another planet. Inside was news that changed everything. I'd inherited property from a great uncle I barely remembered. Uncle Calvin had been the family eccentric, disappearing into the wilderness decades ago with little contact since. Now he was dead, and somehow I owned 40 acres of remote forest land nestled in the mountains, complete with a cabin and access to something called Wanagi Lake. It's probably nothing but a rotting shack, my friend Leave said over coffee later that week. These mountain hermits live in squalor. You'll likely just sell it. But something about the inheritance pulled at me. My life had become a series of predictable days, each blending seamlessly into the next. The monotony of my job, the staleness of my relationships, everything felt worn thin. Maybe this unexpected gift was exactly what I needed. I think I'm going to check it out first, I told her. Take some time off, see what's there. Liv raised an eyebrow. Alone? In the middle of nowhere? It's the 21st century. I'll have my phone, my car. Besides, it's only for a week or two. The drive took nearly 14 hours, the last two on roads that became progressively narrower and more neglected. The GPS signal vanished entirely as I followed the printed directions from the lawyer. When I finally turned onto the unmarked dirt road that supposedly led to my property, the sun was already dipping behind the mountains, casting long, distorted shadows through the trees. The cabin appeared suddenly around a bend, a solid structure of weathered logs with a stone chimney and a small covered porch. It was far more substantial than I'd expected. Not some ramshackle hovel, but a proper dwelling, built to withstand the elements. The surrounding forest pressed close, tall pines and firs creating a natural enclosure that felt both protective and somehow watchful. I parked and stepped out, listening to the profound silence broken only by birdsong and the whisper of wind through branches. The air smelled of pine and earth and something else. Water. Following a narrow trail behind the cabin, I emerged at the shore of Wanagi Lake. The water stretched before me perfectly still, reflecting the mountains and darkening sky like a mirror. According to the papers, the Blackfeet name Wanagi meant spirit or ghost, and standing there as twilight descended, I could understand why. There was something otherworldly about the perfect stillness, the absolute isolation. Returning to the cabin, I used the old iron key the lawyer had provided. The door opened with a low creak. Inside, it was surprisingly clean and orderly. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a worn but comfortable-looking sofa facing it. A basic kitchen occupied one corner, and a door led to what I assumed was a bedroom. Uncle Calvin might have been eccentric, but he wasn't messy. As I explored further, something struck me as odd. While there was a thick layer of dust over everything, it seemed too organized, as if someone had been here recently, straightening things. On the kitchen table sat a leather-bound journal, positioned precisely in the center. I opened it to find my uncle's handwriting, the last entry dated just 3 weeks ago, nearly a week after his supposed death. I hear it again tonight, closer this time. The others say it isn't real, that it's just my mind playing tricks. But I know what I've seen in the shadows between the trees. I know what watches me from the far shore. I should leave this place, but I can't abandon my work. Not when I'm so close to understanding. A chill ran through me as I closed the journal. What had Uncle Calvin been talking about? Who were the others he mentioned? According to the lawyer, he'd lived alone for decades. I continued my inspection of the cabin, finding a door in the hallway that opened to reveal a steep staircase leading to a basement. With no light switch visible, I used my phone's flashlight to illuminate the steps as I descended cautiously. The basement was surprisingly large, extending beyond what I would have guessed was the cabin's footprint. One side was set up as a workspace with a large table covered in maps, notebooks, and strange artifacts. Pieces of what looked like bone and fur, plaster casts of enormous footprints. The back wall was covered entirely in photographs, news clippings, and handwritten notes, all connected by red string in a complex web that made no immediate sense. In the center of it all was a large map of the surrounding area, with Wanagi Lake at its heart. Red circles marked locations around the lake's perimeter, with dates and cryptic notes beside each. The most recent was just a month ago, with a single word beside it. Confirmed. As I leaned closer to examine the markings, a powerful gust of wind shook the cabin above. The basement door slammed shut with a bang that made me jump, plunging the space into darkness save for my phone's beam. Something scraped against the cabin's exterior wall. Something large. From somewhere in the distance came a sound that stopped my breath. Not quite a howl, not quite a scream, but something in between that echoed across the lake and through the trees. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard from any animal I knew. My phone light caught one final detail before I rushed back upstairs. A large, blurry photograph pinned to the center of my uncle's research wall. It showed a massive, dark figure standing at the edge of the lake, half concealed by trees, but unmistakably bipedal and impossibly large. Underneath, my uncle had written a single word: Watcher. Morning brought clarity and a sense of foolishness over my night fears. The wind in these mountains could play tricks, creating sounds that seemed almost human in their resonance. And my uncle's research wall? Probably the harmless obsession of an old man with too much time on his hands. It wouldn't be the first time someone had convinced themselves they'd found evidence of creatures in the wilderness. With daylight streaming through the windows, I made a proper exploration of the cabin. The bedroom contained a comfortable-looking bed with a handmade quilt, a dresser, and a small bookshelf filled with texts on local history, wildlife, and more esoteric subjects: cryptozoology, folklore, and several volumes on indigenous legends of the region. The bathroom was simple but functional, with a clawfoot tub that looked inviting after my long drive. What most caught my attention was a small study off the main room, lined with more bookshelves and containing a desk positioned to look out through a window toward the lake. Here, more of my uncle's research was evident. Notebooks filled with observations of the surrounding wilderness, sketches of tracks and markings he'd found, and detailed accounts of what he called encounters. On the desk sat a more recent journal than the one I'd found last night, and this one was filled with increasingly urgent entries. April 3rd. Found another structure today, North Shore. Like the others, branches woven together nearly 8 feet tall. Too deliberate to be natural, too complex to be hikers. Took samples of the hair caught in the bark. April 10th. Heard calls from across the lake again last night. 3 distinct vocalizations, different locations. They're communicating. April 15th. Footprints outside the cabin this morning. Largest I've measured yet, 17 inches. Whatever it is, it stood at my window for some time. I should be frightened, but I'm fascinated. It's studying me as much as I'm studying it. The final entry was from just days before his death. April 28th. I've finally understood what they want. The old mine contains what they're protecting. Tomorrow I'll attempt contact at the designated site. If I'm right about the artifacts, everything changes. I set the journal down, feeling uneasy. What mine was he talking about? And what kind of contact had he been planning? The lawyer had mentioned nothing about a mine on the property, but clearly it had been significant to my uncle. I decided to explore the land, hoping to find answers, and perhaps determine exactly what had happened to him. According to official reports, he'd died of natural causes, found in his bed by a forest ranger who checked on him periodically. But the journal entries suggested he'd been in the midst of something he considered momentous. Gathering some supplies, water, a small first aid kit, and a hunting knife I'd found in a kitchen drawer, I set out to explore the property. The day was clear but cool, perfect for hiking. Following a faint trail that led around the lake's perimeter, I kept my eyes open for anything unusual. About a mile from the cabin, I found the first structure that matched my uncle's description. It was tall and conical, made of branches and limbs woven together with surprising intricacy. Too deliberate to be random, too complex to be the work of typical hikers. I circled it cautiously, noting how some of the branches seemed to have been broken at specific points rather than cut, requiring considerable strength. As I continued around the lake, I found two more similar structures, each positioned where they weren't easily visible from the water, but provided a clear view of the surrounding forest, almost like blinds for observing without being observed. By mid-afternoon, I'd covered about half of the lake's circumference when I noticed a path leading away from the water, up into the more densely forested hillside. It wasn't a human trail, no markings, no cleared width, but rather a game trail that showed signs of regular use by something large. Following it cautiously, I came upon a clearing where the trees opened up enough to reveal a hillside with an unmistakable dark opening, the entrance to what must have been the mine my uncle mentioned. The area around it showed signs of recent activity. Branches had been cleared away, and there were obvious footprints in the soft earth, some human, likely my uncle's, and others, not human at all. Enormous, with 5 distinct toe impressions, they matched the plaster casts I'd seen in the basement. The mine entrance was partially collapsed, with old rotting timbers barely supporting what remained of the structure. A weathered sign hung crooked. Broken Promise Mine, no entry, danger. Despite the warning, it was clear someone had been inside recently. A modern padlock secured a makeshift gate across the entrance, and fresh scratches around the lock showed it had been used. I hesitated, staring at the dark opening. Whatever my uncle had been researching, whatever he thought was worth contacting something that left 17-inch footprints, it was connected to this mine. But without proper equipment, lights, protective gear, entering would be foolish. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A flash of color that didn't belong among the browns and greens of the forest floor. Kneeling, I discovered a torn piece of fabric caught on a jagged rock. It matched the shirt my uncle had been wearing in a recent photo the lawyer had shown me. More disturbing was what lay next to it, a key with a small plastic tag labeled Mine Gate. Uncle Calvin had been here, likely on that final day mentioned in his journal. Had he entered the mine? Had he found what he was looking for? A sudden crack of breaking wood froze me in place. It had come from deeper in the forest, beyond the mine entrance. Something large was moving through the trees, breaking branches that would have required significant force to snap. I remained perfectly still, barely breathing, as the sounds continued, moving parallel to my position. Never approaching, but never retreating either. Whatever made them seemed to be pacing, watching, assessing. Then came a smell. Musky, wild, unlike anything I'd encountered before. It grew stronger as the unseen presence drew closer to the edge of my vision without ever revealing itself. The standoff lasted perhaps 2 minutes, though it felt like hours. Then, with one final loud snap of timber, the presence retreated, crashing away through the underbrush with surprising speed for something so large. I waited until all was quiet before finally exhaling. My hands were shaking as I pocketed the key and the scrap of my uncle's shirt. The sun was already beginning its descent behind the mountains. I needed to get back to the cabin before dark. As I hurried down the trail, I couldn't shake the certainty that I was being followed, not directly, but paralleled, tracked from just inside the tree line. Occasionally I caught glimpses of movement, always just at the edge of my peripheral vision, always gone when I turned to look directly. When the cabin finally came into view, I nearly cried with relief. I rushed inside, locked the door, and grabbed my phone. No service, as expected. I was completely alone, with night falling and something outside that had taken an interest in me. From the window, I watched the edge of the forest as shadows lengthened. Just before dusk rendered everything indistinct, I saw it. A massive dark figure standing motionless between 2 distant pines. Even from hundreds of yards away, I could tell it was enormous, at least 8 feet tall, and watching the cabin with a stillness that suggested not just animal interest, but conscious observation. As darkness claimed the landscape, I lit the oil lamps my uncle had kept ready and built a fire in the fireplace. The warm light was comforting, but it also made the windows into black mirrors that reflected the room's interior, while concealing whatever might be looking in from outside. Throughout that night, I heard it moving around the cabin. Heavy footsteps on the porch, breathing at the windows, a curious scratching at the door. I sat awake, knife in hand, watching the entrances and listening to the sounds of something that had no business existing in these modern times. By morning, I had reached a decision. I would explore the mine, find what my uncle had discovered, and understand why he'd died. Only then could I leave this place behind. Because one thing had become perfectly clear. Whatever watched from the woods, whatever circled my cabin in the darkness, it wasn't just some animal. It was aware, intelligent, and had been interacting with my uncle for some purpose I still didn't understand. And now, it had turned its attention to me. Dawn broke with a heavy mist clinging to the lake's surface, obscuring the far shore and giving the landscape an otherworldly quality. I had dozed off sometime during the early morning hours, waking with a start to find the fire reduced to embers and sunlight filtering through the windows. A quick check of the cabin's exterior revealed numerous tracks in the soft earth, the same enormous footprints I'd seen by the mine, circling the building several times with particular concentration near the windows and doors. I spent the morning gathering supplies for my expedition to the mine. From my uncle's storage shed, I recovered a hard hat with a headlamp, heavy gloves, and a sturdy backpack. I packed water, energy bars, a first aid kit, and extra batteries. Most importantly, I found a shotgun mounted on brackets in the bedroom closet, along with a box of shells. I wasn't much of a gun person, but I knew enough to check that it was functional and load it properly. Before leaving, I studied my uncle's journals more carefully, looking for specific mentions of what he'd found in the mine. The entries were frustratingly vague, referring to artifacts and evidence without clear descriptions. One passage stood out. The connection between the mine's collapse in 1892 and the first documented sightings cannot be coincidental. The survivors' accounts mention retribution from the mountain guardians and those who walked before. They knew what they had disturbed. The sealed chamber on the third level contains the proof. Other entries referenced local indigenous legends about tall ones who lived in the mountains, protecting sacred sites from human intrusion. My uncle had apparently interviewed tribal elders from the region, who told him the area around Wanagi Lake had been considered forbidden territory for centuries, a place where the boundary between worlds was thin, and ancient beings still walked. By mid-morning, I was ready to depart. The mist had burned off, revealing a perfect blue sky that belied the anxiety churning in my stomach. I left a detailed note in the cabin explaining where I was going, on the off chance someone came looking for me if I didn't return. The hike to the mine seemed shorter in daylight, though no less unsettling. Twice I heard movement in the underbrush paralleling my path, but nothing showed itself. At the mine entrance, I paused to study the ground more carefully. Fresh tracks led both into and out of the mine. My uncle had indeed entered, and apparently exited as well. But other tracks overlapped his, the enormous footprints now familiar to me. Whatever made them had followed him inside. Using the key I'd found, I unlocked the rusted gate and swung it open with a protesting squeal of metal. The entrance tunnel was surprisingly intact, shored up with timbers that had been maintained over the years, possibly by my uncle. My headlamp revealed a passage that extended about 20 feet before taking a downward turn. Taking a deep breath, I stepped inside. The air was cool and damp, with that distinctive mineral smell of underground spaces. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, a steady plink that echoed through the passage. My footsteps sounded unnaturally loud on the stone floor. The main tunnel sloped steadily downward with smaller offshoots branching away at intervals. Following my uncle's journal descriptions, I knew I needed to reach the third level down. Old wooden signs marked the way, though many were rotted or fallen. The first level contained mostly collapsed tunnels and rusted equipment. The second opened into a larger chamber that had clearly been the main work area, with the remnants of an ore processing station and crumbling carts on narrow-gauge rails. Finding the passage to the third level proved challenging. According to the journal, it had been deliberately obscured after the mine's abandonment. Eventually, I located a section of wall that seemed newer than its surroundings. Looking carefully, I found a metal ring nearly hidden among the rocks at floor level. Pulling it revealed a trapdoor leading to a steep set of stairs cut directly into the stone. My headlamp barely penetrated the darkness below. For a moment I hesitated, Every instinct warned against going deeper, away from the surface and safety. But I had come too far to turn back. The stairs descended in a tight spiral for what felt like hundreds of feet. The air grew colder and somehow heavier, pressing against my skin with an almost physical weight. When I finally reached the bottom, I found myself in a narrow passage that opened into a chamber much larger than I had expected. My light couldn't reach the far walls or ceiling, creating the disorienting sensation of standing on the edge of a void. The floor was smooth, unnaturally so, as if polished by centuries of use. And there, in the center of what my light could illuminate, stood a structure that stopped me cold. It wasn't part of the mine. It wasn't something built by the miners who had worked these tunnels. It was older, much older. A circular arrangement of stone pillars, each carved with symbols I didn't recognize, surrounding a central altar-like slab. The entire structure reminded me of a miniature Stonehenge, but these stones were black as coal and seemed to absorb my light rather than reflect it. On the central slab lay what I initially took to be a pile of cloth. Moving closer, I realized it was my uncle's jacket, neatly folded, with his journal placed on top. Beside these items were artifacts clearly collected from elsewhere in the chamber. Fragments of carved stone, a piece of what looked like an enormous vertebra, and a container filled with coarse, dark hair. I picked up the journal with trembling hands and opened it to the final pages. The last entry was dated the day of his supposed death. I was right. They are guardians, not monsters. What sleeps beneath must never be disturbed. The chamber beyond the pillars contains their most sacred site, where they've performed rites since before humans walked these lands. They've allowed me to observe from a distance, the greatest privilege any researcher could hope for. Tonight, I will return one final time to complete my documentation. They have accepted my presence, but I harbor no illusions about my status. I am merely a tolerated witness to something ancient and powerful. If anything happens to me, whoever finds this should know. Do not fear them unless you threaten what they protect. Leave this place, seal the entrance, let them continue their vigil in peace. Some secrets belong to older powers than ours. The final line was written in a shakier hand. They're coming. I hear them descending. This may be my final entry. I lowered the journal, a chill running through me despite the sweat beading on my forehead. What had happened to my uncle after writing those words? If he'd died here, how had his body been found in his bed at the cabin? A sound from deeper in the chamber froze me in place. A scraping, like stone against stone, followed by what could only be described as rhythmic thumping, like massive footsteps approaching from beyond my light's reach. I barely had time to duck behind one of the stone pillars before something emerged from the darkness. It was enormous, at least 9 feet tall, with a powerful frame covered in dark, matted hair. Its face remained in shadow, but I caught glimpses of intelligent eyes reflecting my hidden light's glow. Behind it came another, slightly smaller, but moving with the same deliberate grace. Their footsteps matched exactly the prints I'd found around the cabin and mine entrance. They approached the central slab, seemingly unaware of my presence. The larger one carried something in its massive hands, a bundle wrapped in what looked like animal hides. With surprising gentleness, it placed this bundle on the stone surface. Then both creatures began a series of movements that could only be described as ceremonial, accompanied by low, rumbling vocalizations that seemed to make the very air vibrate. I remained frozen, barely breathing, as the ritual continued. These were not animals. Their movements were too purposeful, too laden with obvious meaning. They were performing something sacred, something ancient, in a place that had clearly been theirs long before humans discovered the mountain's mineral wealth. As they finished and turned to leave, disaster struck. My hand, numb from maintaining my crouched position, slipped from the stone pillar. I caught myself, but not before dislodging a small cascade of pebbles that clattered across the chamber floor. Both creatures stopped instantly, heads turning with unnerving coordination toward my hiding place. For a breathless moment, nothing moved. Then, with shocking speed for being so large, they charged toward me. I ran, abandoning all pretense of stealth, racing back toward the spiral stairs with the sound of massive bodies in pursuit echoing behind me. I took the stairs two at a time, my headlamp bouncing wildly, creating a disorienting strobe effect that nearly sent me tumbling back down. Reaching the second level, I risked a glance back. One of the creatures was navigating the stairs, moving with a fluid grace that defied its size. Its eyes caught my light, amber gold and unmistakably aware. There was no mindless pursuit in that gaze, but calculated intent. I continued upward, lungs burning, legs trembling with effort. The shotgun bounced uselessly against my back. I'd never have time to turn and aim. My only hope was reaching the surface and somehow sealing the entrance behind me. When I finally burst into sunlight, I nearly wept with relief. Sprinting to the gate, I slammed it shut and fumbled with the padlock, fingers clumsy with adrenaline. Just as the lock clicked into place, a massive impact from the other side sent me sprawling backward. The gate bulged outward but held. Another impact followed, then another. Metal screamed as hinges threatened to tear free from stone. I scrambled away, waiting for the inevitable moment when the barrier would fail. Then suddenly the assault stopped. A deep, reverberating vocalization echoed from within the tunnel. Not a roar of rage, but something more complex, with distinct patterns that sounded almost like language. After a moment, a different call answered from deeper inside. Silence followed, stretching for so long that I began to wonder if they had retreated. Then a face appeared in the small gap between the gate and tunnel wall, not pressing forward, just watching. Even in shadow, I could make out a massive brow, deep-set eyes, and a jaw that suggested power beyond human capacity. Those eyes held mine for a long moment, communicating something beyond language. Not simple animal rage or fear, but a complex emotion I couldn't fully comprehend. Something between warning and sorrow. Then it was gone, retreating into darkness. I remained rooted to the spot, unable to process what had happened. Only when the sun began to dip toward the horizon did I finally gather myself enough to return to the cabin, constantly looking over my shoulder, certain I was being watched from the trees. That night, nothing circled the cabin. No breathing sounded at the windows. No footsteps creaked the porch boards. The forest remained silent, as if holding its breath, waiting for a decision to be made. In that silence, I realized I faced a choice my uncle had apparently made before me. I could leave this place, report what I'd found, bring others to investigate. Or I could honor what seemed to be my uncle's final wish, to protect the secret of what dwelled in these mountains, guarding something ancient and perhaps necessary. As I considered, a small sound drew me to the window. There, at the edge of the lake, illuminated by moonlight, stood the largest creature I'd seen yet. It raised a hand, so like a human's but massively out of scale, and seemed to beckon. It waited, patient and still, clearly visible and making no attempt to hide. An invitation. Or perhaps a test. I spent that night in a state of half-sleep, jerking awake at every creak and whisper of wind. By morning, I'd made my decision. Whatever had happened to my uncle, whatever secret he'd discovered in his years of research, I needed to understand it. Not just for closure, but because something fundamental had shifted in my perception of the world. If these creatures existed, intelligent, purposeful beings that had remained hidden from broader human awareness, what else might be real that we'd dismissed as myth or legend? The morning light revealed no tracks around the cabin, no evidence of my visitor from the previous night. But at the lake's edge, where I'd seen the creature standing, I found a single clear footprint in the mud. Enormous, 5-toed, pressed deep into the earth. Beside it lay a small object that caught the light. A carved piece of dark green stone, shaped into what appeared to be a stylized mountain peak with strange symbols etched into its base. I recognized it immediately as matching artifacts in my uncle's collection, similar to fragments I'd seen on the altar in the mine. This was no accident, no dropped item. It was a deliberate placement. A message. Returning to the cabin, I spent hours poring over my uncle's research papers and journals, seeking any mention of similar objects or their significance. Eventually, in his earliest journal, I found a reference. The elders speak of calling stones, carved tokens used for generations to request audience with the forest guardians. Placed at specific sites during the correct lunar phase, they are said to open communication. Naturally, I dismissed this as folklore, until I found the first carved stone fragment at the lake's edge after my initial sighting. 2 nights later, they approached the cabin for the first time. With trembling fingers, I flipped to the calendar. Tonight would be the full moon, the same lunar phase mentioned repeatedly in my uncle's accounts of significant encounters. Further searches through his papers revealed what I'd been missing: a hidden compartment in his desk containing his most private journal. This one was different from the research logs, more personal and emotionally raw. The entries painted a picture of a man who had gone from skeptical researcher to someone profoundly changed by what he'd discovered. The final pages contained the truth about his death, or rather, his disappearance. They've made an offer I never expected. After years of observation and cautious interaction, they've invited me to witness their most sacred ritual, what they call the renewal. No outsider has seen this in centuries, perhaps longer. The price is high. I must disappear from the human world. A body will be found, not mine, but one that will pass casual inspection. My affairs will be settled, my property transferred as I've arranged. I will be declared dead, freeing me to accept this final invitation. To whoever finds this, likely my heir, if all goes as planned. I'm sorry for the deception. But the knowledge I'll gain, the trust I've been offered, is worth more than the life I'm leaving behind. These beings have guarded ancient secrets since before our civilization began. They remember what we've forgotten, protect what we never knew existed. I go willingly into their world. I set the journal down, mind reeling. My uncle wasn't dead, or at least hadn't been when this was written. He had staged his own death to... what? Join these creatures? Learn from them? The journal didn't specify exactly what the renewal ritual entailed or what had happened after. One thing was clear. The property transfer, my inheritance, had been deliberately planned. He had wanted someone, me, to find this place, his research, perhaps even the creatures themselves. But why? The last page contained what appeared to be instructions, written in a hurried hand. If you've found this, and chosen to stay rather than flee, you've passed the first test. The stone is an invitation. At moonrise, take it to the western shore, where the 3 tallest pines stand together. Place it on the flat rock at the water's edge. Then wait. They will come. Listen to what they offer. Whatever you decide, remember. Their existence must remain protected. Too many would destroy what they don't understand. I checked my watch. 4 hours until sunset, perhaps 5 until moonrise. Time enough to prepare, to consider what I was about to do. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave, to dismiss everything as the elaborate fantasy of an old man who had spent too many years alone in the wilderness. But I had seen them with my own eyes, felt their presence, witnessed their deliberate actions. The remaining hours passed in a blur of preparation and anxious waiting. I gathered supplies, flashlight, water, my uncle's journal for reference, and tried to calm my racing thoughts. What did they want with me? What had happened to my uncle? Was I walking into danger or something else entirely? As dusk settled over the lake, I made my way to the western shore. The 3 tallest pines were easy to spot, their massive trunks and towering height distinguishing them from their neighbors. At their base, where forest met shore, a flat rock jutted out over the water's edge, a natural altar of sorts. I placed the carved stone in the center of the rock's surface, then retreated a short distance to wait among the trees. The moon had not yet risen, but its glow was beginning to illuminate the eastern sky. The lake's surface was perfectly still, reflecting the emerging stars like a vast mirror. Time stretched as I waited, fighting the urge to flee with each passing minute. Just as the full moon crested the distant mountains, sending a silver path across the water, I heard them coming, not with crashes through the underbrush as before, but with a silent, deliberate approach that somehow made their presence even more imposing. They emerged from the forest on the opposite shore, 3 massive figures silhouetted against the moonlight. They stood motionless for a long moment, as if assessing the situation, then entered the water. I expected splashing, but they moved with surprising grace, barely disturbing the surface as they crossed. I remained frozen in my hiding place as they reached my side of the lake and approached the stone I'd placed. The largest of them, at least 9 feet tall with shoulders twice the width of a large man, picked up the carved token and examined it. Then, with deliberate slowness, it turned toward my hiding place, eyes finding mine unerringly in the darkness. "You can approach," a voice said, not from the creature, but from beside me. I nearly cried out in shock, spinning to find a human figure standing just feet away, an old man with a weathered face and familiar eyes. My uncle. "Calvin?" I whispered, disbelieving. He nodded, a slight smile crossing his face. "I'm sorry for the deception. It was necessary. Come, they're waiting." Too stunned to resist, I followed as he led me toward the shore where the 3 massive beings waited. In the moonlight, I could see them clearly for the first time. Tall, powerful forms covered in dark hair, with faces that combined ape-like features with something unmistakably intelligent and almost human. Their eyes followed our approach with evident awareness. "They've been here for thousands of years," my uncle said quietly. "Long before humans built cities or wrote histories. They remember the ice retreating, the first people arriving in these valleys. They've watched us grow, spread, forget the old ways." We stopped a respectful distance from the creatures. The largest one made a series of gestures accompanied by deep, rumbling vocalizations. "He welcomes you," my uncle translated. "They've been watching since you arrived, assessing whether you could be trusted." "Trusted with what?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "With knowledge, with responsibility." My uncle turned to face me fully. "They're dying out. Their numbers dwindle with each generation as their habitat shrinks, as humans encroach further into the last wild places. This valley, this mountain, is one of their final strongholds." The creature made another series of sounds. "They've maintained their vigil all this time," my uncle continued, "protecting something ancient, something powerful buried deep beneath the mountain. The mine accidentally breached the outer chamber, which is why they intervened, frightening the miners away with what became the first documented Bigfoot sightings in this region." "What are they protecting?" I asked. My uncle's expression grew solemn. "They call it the Sleeper. I've only glimpsed it from a distance, but it's not from this world. It crashed here long before humans evolved, bringing something the Guardians call the change-making. It transforms living things, accelerates evolution. They believe it's responsible for their own development, their intelligence." He gestured toward the lake. "This entire valley is saturated with its influence, though contained by the Guardians' efforts. They use rituals to keep it dormant, to prevent it from awakening fully." "And you joined them?" I asked, still struggling to process his apparent defection from humanity. "I was offered a rare honor, to learn their ways, to help document their history and knowledge before it's lost. They're near the end of their time. They know this. They want their story preserved, even if their existence must remain hidden." The largest Guardian made a long, complex series of sounds, gesturing toward me repeatedly. My uncle listened intently, then turned to me with surprise. "They're offering you a choice, the same one they offered me. Stay, learn, help preserve their knowledge, or return to your life, but protect their secret." "Why me?" I asked. "Because you're my blood," he said simply. "Because you came here seeking truth rather than profit from this land. Because you faced your fear in the mine, but didn't bring others to hunt them." The guardian stepped forward, extending an enormous hand in which rested another carved stone. This one larger and more intricate than the first. This is their token of trust, my uncle explained. If you accept it, you agree to become a guardian of their secret, whether you stay or go. Few humans have ever been offered this honor. I stared at the offered stone, my mind racing with implications. Everything I thought I knew about the world had been upended in the span of days. Creatures of legend stood before me, intelligent and purposeful. My supposedly dead uncle lived among them. Beneath the mountain lay something not of this earth. What happened to the body they found? I asked, still grappling with practical questions. My uncle's expression darkened. A hiker who died of exposure years ago. They preserved it, knowing it might be needed. I'm not proud of that deception, but it was necessary. The guardian made an impatient sound, arm still extended with the offered stone. You must decide, my uncle said. Dawn approaches, and they must return to their sanctuary before daylight. I looked from my uncle to the massive beings waiting expectantly, then beyond to the peaceful lake reflecting the full moon. Whatever choice I made would permanently alter the course of my life, and potentially impact beings who had guarded their secrets for millennia. With a deep breath, I reached out and accepted the stone. 1 year has passed since that moonlit night by Wanagi Lake. 1 year since I made a choice that changed everything. I didn't stay, as my uncle had. After 3 weeks learning their basic communication and understanding the full scope of what the Guardians protected, I returned to my former life, but only to put affairs in order. I told friends I was taking a sabbatical, perhaps writing a book. Few questioned it. My life had always been somewhat solitary and independent. Now I divide my time between worlds. 3 weeks of each month, I live in the cabin, learning the ancient knowledge my uncle translates from the Guardians. Their history is rich and complex, a parallel civilization that evolved alongside our own but chose secrecy and isolation over technological advancement. They possess understanding of the natural world that modern science is only beginning to grasp. 1 week each month, I return to civilization to maintain appearances and to subtly protect their existence through carefully placed misinformation. When reports of sightings emerge nearby, I'm there with rational explanations and falsified evidence pointing elsewhere. The property remains private, inaccessible, its boundaries now marked with warnings that discourage casual trespassers. The Guardians, they have a name for themselves that's difficult for human tongues to pronounce, so I've continued calling them by this title, have shown me wonders I could never have imagined. Deep cave systems that run for miles beneath the mountains. Ancient artifacts left by civilizations even they only dimly remember. And glimpses, just glimpses of the sleeper. A presence so alien and powerful that even after a year, I can barely comprehend what little I've seen. My uncle grows frailer with each passing month. He won't admit it, but I know his time among us is limited. The Guardians know it too. They've begun teaching me directly, no longer relying on his translations. Their language is challenging, part vocalization, part gesture, part something almost telepathic, but I'm learning. They seem pleased with my progress, though it's sometimes difficult to read emotions on their non-human faces. Last night, under another full moon, I participated in my first renewal ritual, the ceremony that maintains the sleeper's dormancy. Deep in the sacred chamber beneath the mountain, surrounded by guardians performing movements unchanged for thousands of years, I felt the power they work so diligently to contain. It pulsed beneath us, a living force with its own awareness, neither malevolent nor benevolent, but utterly alien in its purpose. Afterward, the eldest guardian, the one I've come to know as the teacher, showed me ancient markings deep in the caverns, depictions of what happened the last time the sleeper stirred from its slumber. The images were disturbing. Landscapes transformed, creatures changed in frightening ways. A world thrown into chaos as the boundaries between possible and impossible broke down. This is why we watch, my uncle translated, though I was beginning to understand the Guardian's meaning directly. This is why we remain. Today, as I write this account in my uncle's journal, now mine, I watch through the cabin window as two young guardians move through the forest's edge. They're learning the boundaries they must patrol, the signs they must watch for. They're the next generation of an ancient lineage, and they're fewer than those who came before. They know their kind is fading, that each generation sees fewer births, that their territory shrinks as humans expand ever outward. They face their eventual extinction with a dignity I find humbling. But they're determined their duty will not die with them. That's why they've chosen me, and others like me in different regions. We are to become the new guardians when they are gone, keeping watch over forces too dangerous to be unleashed, preserving knowledge too powerful to be forgotten. I've come to understand that Bigfoot sightings throughout history weren't mistakes or hoaxes or misidentifications, at least not all of them. They were glimpses of guardians fulfilling their ancient purpose, protecting humanity from truths we weren't ready to face. Night falls over Wanagi Lake. Soon I'll join my uncle and the guardians for another lesson in their ancient knowledge. Tomorrow perhaps we'll visit the deeper chambers where older secrets wait. And next week, I'll return briefly to the human world, carrying my dual identity like a secret talisman. I sometimes wonder what might have happened if I'd chosen differently that night. If I'd taken the stone but betrayed their trust, revealing their existence to the world. Would we have destroyed them in our fear? Would the sleeper have awakened without their vigil? Would something fundamental about our reality have changed? I'll never know. The choice I made has set my path. I am becoming what my uncle became before me, a bridge between worlds, a keeper of ancient truths. From the forest comes a call, deep, resonant, carrying further than any human voice could reach. It's time. They're waiting. I close this journal and prepare to answer. The night is dark, but I know the way. I've become part of something older and larger than myself, a continuous chain of guardians stretching back to the dawn of human consciousness. And in that knowledge, I found a purpose I never knew I was seeking. I am the guardian of Wanagi Lake, and I am no longer afraid of what watches from the shadows.